Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. Rain had begun earlier that morning, a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the edges of the forested hills along the narrow dirt road. At the bend where the old bridge leaned slightly, as though in a subtle nod to the river below, something half buried in moss and fallen leaves caught the eye. It was a bicycle, its paint dulled and rusted, propped awkwardly against the bank. No one knew when it had arrived there, and there were no footprints nearby, only the quiet trickle of water and the occasional rustle of wet leaves. The town nearest the bridge was small, scarcely more than a scattering of wooden houses and a single gas station that smelled faintly of oil and coffee. Its streets were empty this morning, apart from the occasional cat slinking along the curb. Conversations between locals were whispered, carried softly across the misty air, as if the rain had made everyone quieter, more watchful. The bridge became a subtle point of focus, a place where the ordinary world seemed to pause. Investigators arrived slowly, moving with the measured precision of people who knew that patience often revealed more than urgency. The bicycle was examined under the muted light, every drop of rain giving a soft sheen to its worn metal. Nearby, the river flowed without disturbance, reflecting the gray sky like a sheet of glass. It was impossible to tell how long the bicycle had been there, and that uncertainty settled like a soft fog across the minds of those who had come to look. A few houses up the road, a cabin with paint flaking from its shutters seemed to hold a quiet secret of its own. Inside, the floorboards creaked under the weight of careful footsteps. Dust motes floated lazily through the air, illuminated by thin slivers of morning light. On a wooden table, a notebook lay open, pages filled with dates and names written in careful script. No one claimed ownership, and yet it seemed to have been left deliberately, a subtle breadcrumb in a world otherwise untouched by disturbance. Beyond the cabin, the forest deepened. Moss-covered trees stood like silent sentinels, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth. Along the narrow trail, a broken lantern rested at the edge of a shallow ditch. Its glass was cloudy with condensation, and inside, a faint wick remained. No one had passed that way recently, or at least, no one had been seen. The investigators followed the trail anyway, their boots leaving soft impressions in the darkened soil. Along a ridge overlooking the valley, the fog hung low, curling between the pines. A small shed crouched beneath the slope, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and wood polish. Tools lay scattered across the floor, some partially covered by tattered cloth. One hammer, unusually polished at the handle, seemed almost out of place among the rest. It was the sort of detail that drew attention slowly, quietly, making the mind turn in silent circles. The riverbank further downstream offered another subtle anomaly. Driftwood had gathered in a curved pattern along the edge, shaped by current and wind, yet in the center lay a small bundle of folded fabric. It was patterned, too bright for the muted environment, and yet it bore no name, no indication of why it had come to rest there. Birds stirred in the branches overhead, and water rippled gently around stones smoothed by years of slow erosion. Every element was ordinary, and yet together, they hinted at something just beyond comprehension. Walking along the abandoned road that led toward the hills, an old diner appeared, its windows clouded and streaked with years of rain. Inside, The booths were empty, and the counter held only the faint residue of old coffee and sugar. A newspaper lay on the floor, its pages yellowed, an article circled in blue ink. No one in town remembered the story well. It was as if the diner had kept it hidden, a memory folded quietly into peeling wallpaper and cracked tiles. Late in the afternoon, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing the coastline in the distance. A dock jutted out over calm waters, its boards warped and uneven. A rowboat rested tied to a post, the rope frayed but still holding. Underneath, small scratches marred the wood, seemingly random, yet forming a pattern only perceptible to someone willing to wait and watch. The waves lapped gently, a rhythmic whisper against the aging pier. In a field beyond the village, a greenhouse stood, glass panels fogged and streaked with condensation. Inside, empty pots sat in orderly rows, and the faint scent of soil lingered. A single chair faced the window, and on its seat, a pair of gloves lay folded neatly. They were clean, unusual in a place meant for dirt and growth, as though someone had left them deliberately for someone else to find. Outside, the wind stirred the tall grass, carrying the soft hum of the countryside. Each discovery felt like a page turning slowly in an unhurried book. Objects and locations hinted at a story that never revealed itself outright. A forgotten letter tucked in the corner of a shed. Footprints leading nowhere in the soft sand of the riverbank. A faint trail of berries along the edge of the forest, crushed and rearranged in patterns that might have been intentional, or might have been nature's quiet randomness. The town itself seemed to breathe slowly around these observations, its streets and buildings patient witnesses to the unfolding enigma. By evening, the mist had returned, settling over the hills and forest like a protective veil. Street lamps flickered on, casting halos of light through the fog. Each corner, each alleyway, seemed to whisper questions more than answers. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then silence returned. And still, the bicycle remained at the bridge, unchanged and quietly enigmatic, waiting for the next small detail to reveal itself to those who were willing to move slowly, listen carefully, and notice the subtle threads woven through a quiet, remote world. Morning arrived quietly, pale light seeping through low clouds. The bridge, still slick from the overnight drizzle, reflected a muted gray, and the bicycle remained where it had been left. Across the river, an old ranger station huddled against the slope, its windows dark and faintly fogged. The path leading to it was overgrown, reeds brushing ankles of anyone who passed, soft and yielding underfoot. Inside, the station smelled faintly of pine and old varnish. A stack of maps lay on a counter, edges curling with age. On one, several points were marked in red ink, not recent but precise, forming a loose pattern across the surrounding forest. The quiet hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the floorboards were the only sounds. Outside, a single bird perched on the roof, its head tilting as if listening. Further along the river, the investigators discovered a small, abandoned boathouse. Its door hung open, squeaking softly with the wind. Inside, the wooden floor was damp, water pooling near the corners. A tangle of rope lay coiled neatly on a shelf, alongside a faded life vest. On a hook, a fishing net with small tiers hinted at repeated use, though no one had been seen in the area recently. The stillness of the place made every movement feel amplified. The road leading back toward the village wound through a quiet pine forest. Sunlight filtered through needles, forming soft, shifting patterns on the ground. At the edge of the path, a tiny stone monument stood, weathered and lichen-covered. Its inscription was barely legible, the letters worn by years of rain. Beneath it, an arrangement of small stones suggested someone had placed them carefully, a private act unnoticed by the world. A few blocks from the center of town, a small antique shop opened onto the main street. Its windows were dusty but transparent enough to reveal shelves of old bottles, clocks, and photographs. The shopkeeper, a quiet woman with calm eyes, spoke slowly about the town's history, mentioning names of people who had once lived here but were no longer around. On a shelf near the back, a journal lay open, pages yellowed with time. Faded ink traced faint patterns and drawings, some resembling trails and paths through the nearby hills. Beyond the village, a gravel road led to a small lake tucked into a hollow between two hills. Mist hovered above the water, curling gently as though breathing. At the edge of the lake, a wooden platform extended a few feet over the surface. On it, an old chair sat facing the water, slightly tilted. Near its legs, small footprints pressed softly into the damp earth, but they vanished abruptly into the grass, as if whoever had made them had stepped into the fog itself. A narrow path led from the lake deeper into the forest. Moss covered every tree trunk, and the air smelled of wet bark and distant soil. Along the trail, a half-buried crate was found, lit ajar. Inside, a collection of worn notebooks rested, some pages missing, others filled with lists of names, locations, and times, recorded meticulously but without explanation. The quiet crackle of leaves underfoot mingled with the faint rustle of branches overhead, marking the slow passage of hours. In the hills to the east, a cabin appeared at the edge of a clearing. Its roof sagged slightly, and smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though no one was seen inside. Around the cabin, the grass was neatly trimmed in some areas and overgrown in others, as if someone had moved through methodically, but not recently. A small bench near the door held a collection of stones, arranged carefully, smooth and flat, each one slightly different in color. On a side road leading away from the cabin, a series of abandoned structures appeared, perhaps old worker cottages from a time long past. Doors swung gently in the wind, windows cracked but holding reflections of the gray sky. In one, a table remained, set with mismatched cups and plates as if someone had stepped away briefly and never returned. Beneath it, a folded piece of cloth, pale and embroidered, hinted at attention to detail amid neglect. Down another trail, the investigators came across a forgotten dock, jutting into a still pond ringed with reeds. A single rowboat leaned against the side, its oars balanced delicately within. Along the dock's edge, tiny scratches marred the wood, forming no obvious pattern but suggesting repeated, deliberate contact. Dragonflies skimmed the water, their soft, sudden movements the only disturbance in the otherwise perfect stillness. As dusk approached, the forest around the lake darkened further, shadows stretching long and slow. A faint path wound through the trees, leading to a stone well with a rusted cover. Water lapped quietly inside, its surface smooth and reflective. At the base of the well, small footprints circled in shallow mud, tracing a hesitant pattern, coming close to the edge and retreating. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if watching, patient and undisturbed. Beyond the well, a narrow track led toward a cluster of low hills. Among the rocks, a small wooden crate lay partially covered by ferns. Inside were fragments of old photographs, edges curling, showing people in familiar town locations from decades ago. Faces were blurred or cut off, yet a pattern emerged, subtle and disjointed, as if someone had attempted to preserve memory selectively, carefully choosing what to leave behind. At the far edge of the hills, a single windswept cabin appeared, its siding pale and weathered. Inside, faint signs of habitation remained. A kettle on a stove, a chair tucked slightly askew beneath a table, and a notebook lying open, pages filled with careful, looping handwriting. Observers noticed small symbols, tiny marks and margins, almost imperceptible, yet forming a rhythm only detectable in quiet reflection. A narrow dirt road descended from the cabin toward an abandoned service station, its pumps still standing but unused. On the cracked concrete, a set of faint tracks led from the roadside into the overgrown lot. Near the pumps, a pile of carefully stacked stones rested, each one balancing against another. No sign of recent visitors was apparent, yet the arrangement suggested human intent, deliberate and patient. From the service station, a trail continued into dense forest, eventually opening onto a wide meadow. The grass swayed gently, and small wildflowers dotted the edges. In the center, a small, collapsed tent lay partially covered in leaves. Inside, nothing remained but a few scraps of fabric and a journal, its pages damp but legible. Sketches of surrounding trees and hills filled the pages, accompanied by notes in a meticulous, slow hand. At the edge of the meadow, a forgotten railway track curved gently into the distance. Ties were moss-covered, rails rusty but intact. Alongside, an abandoned signal box leaned precariously, its windows cracked. Inside, a lantern rested, unlit. The quiet click of the metal beneath the investigator's boots echoed faintly, a soft metronome marking the passage of time in the empty landscape. Along the railway, a small stream ran parallel, water moving with a hushed urgency. Pebbles in the shallows bore subtle scratches, as if something had moved against them repeatedly. A piece of fabric, faintly patterned, had been caught on a low branch nearby, fluttering softly in the evening breeze. The scene felt untouched yet intimate, a secret left to linger in the quiet. Near the stream, an old farmstead appeared, its buildings leaning gently with age. The barn door was ajar, swinging slowly, and hay spilled softly across the floor. In the loft, remnants of old crates and boxes were scattered, some containing papers, some simply empty. Along the fence, carvings were etched faintly into the weathered wood, initials, dates, and shapes, barely perceptible, a private record of presence over time. A small path led beyond the farmstead into a grove of towering pines. The air smelled rich and damp, the earth soft beneath feet. At the center, a circle of stones formed a quiet boundary. Inside, moss covered the ground completely. A single, slender sapling had been placed in the middle, its leaves swaying with the breeze, delicate and intentional in its solitude. Further down the grove, a wooden cabin sat hidden, its windows fogged and opaque. Inside, a lantern lay on a small table, unlit but polished, reflecting the faint light from outside. In a corner, a shelf held a stack of small boxes, each labeled carefully with dates and locations. The boxes themselves were closed, secrets waiting quietly to be noticed. The path continued toward a rocky cliff overlooking the coastline. Waves lapped gently against stones far below, rhythmic and slow. Along the cliff edge, a small bench had been placed, worn smooth from years of use. A notebook rested on it, pages filled with careful, looping entries detailing walks through the woods, observations of wildlife, and fleeting patterns noticed along the river and hills. At the foot of the cliff, a narrow cave opened, dark and inviting. Its entrance was lined with faint markings, etched into stone, subtle but deliberate. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of earth and distant water. A small pile of smooth stones rested against the wall, arranged in quiet symmetry. Each stone seemed chosen for shape and color, a deliberate arrangement hidden from the world above. The investigators traced a trail from the cave through a thin valley, leading to a small clearing dotted with wildflowers. Here, a forgotten picnic area remained, rusted metal tables and benches half buried in grass. On one table, a tin box was discovered, its lid closed, edges weathered. Inside, faint impressions of letters and numbers could be seen pressed into the metal, markings that hinted at a hidden code or message left for someone who would notice slowly, carefully, and quietly. The investigators lingered at the picnic clearing as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the rusted tables. A narrow trail led away from the site, winding through low brush and into a stand of birch trees. The bark, pale against the darkening undergrowth, seemed to reflect the dimming light, creating the sense of a quiet corridor guiding them deeper into the woods. A few minutes along the trail, they came upon a small, abandoned greenhouse, its glass panels streaked with rain and fog. Inside, empty pots rested on metal racks, and the soil in the beds was cracked and dry. On a low shelf, a single watering can was polished to a soft sheen, unusually clean for a place that had not been in use for years. It seemed placed deliberately, a quiet signal to someone who might notice. Beyond the greenhouse, the trail opened onto a tiny, forgotten orchard. Trees stood in neat rows, their trunks wrapped in protective cloth, though the fruit had long since fallen. On the ground, patterns in the leaves and fallen branches suggested careful attention, like someone had walked through slowly, arranging things with care. A faint smell of apple lingered, faint but lingering in the damp air. Nearby, a narrow dirt road cut through the forest, leading toward a small, abandoned motel. Its neon sign flickered faintly, though the bulbs were long dead. The parking lot was overgrown with grass, and weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt. A lobby door creaked open, revealing a dusty interior. Inside, a reception desk held a ledger, its pages filled with names and dates, some crossed out and others circled. Every entry seemed deliberate, precise, but without explanation. A few blocks from the motel, a quiet cafe stood at the edge of town, its windows clouded but warm light spilling faintly onto the empty street. Inside, the owner, a soft-spoken man with spectacles perched low on his nose, spoke in slow, measured sentences. He mentioned noticing strangers in the area over the past months, people who wandered the woods and trails without obvious purpose. On a counter, a small notebook lay open, filled with sketches of local flora and fauna, small notes on paths, streams, and hidden hollows. Across the town, a narrow footbridge led to a marshy inlet. The water was still, reflecting the muted pink and gray sky of early evening. Along the edges, reeds whispered softly in the breeze. Near the water, a collection of small driftwood pieces had been arranged into a loose circle. No one had passed this way recently, yet the pattern suggested intent, deliberate yet gentle, a quiet mark left on the world. Deeper into the marsh, a raised boardwalk wound through the reeds. Beneath it, water lapped against hidden roots, and the faint croak of frogs punctuated the still air. At the midpoint of the walkway, a small bundle of sticks and leaves had been gathered, forming a rough nest-like shape. It seemed untouched, yet purposeful, as if someone had left it for careful eyes to find. A narrow path from the boardwalk led to a hill crowned with a small stone chapel. Its walls were weathered, moss creeping along the stones. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a dark interior where sunlight filtered through colored glass. Inside, benches were polished smooth, dust settled in corners, and a single candle rested on the altar. Though unlit, its wick was unburned, waiting. A quiet reverence filled the space, a presence almost palpable in the still air. Descending from the chapel, a winding forest road appeared, lined with pines and low underbrush. Halfway along, a small, hidden trail veered off toward a cluster of abandoned cabins. Each cabin leaned slightly, weathered but intact. Inside, remnants of life lingered. A pair of boots neatly aligned by a doorway, a stack of folded blankets on a cot, and a small shelf holding jars of dried herbs, all untouched by time or visitor. Near one cabin, a faint scent of smoke lingered, though no fire had burned recently. A metal pot lay overturned on the ground, and beside it, a carefully folded piece of fabric rested, clean and deliberate. Patterns in the grass around suggested someone had moved slowly in circles, arranging small, quiet markers. Every detail seemed deliberate yet hidden, a language of subtlety. Further along the road, a small lake appeared, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the trees and sky. A narrow dock extended into the water, boards weathered and gray. At the end, a single wooden crate sat, closed but not locked. Inside, layers of newspaper and old sketches revealed careful documentation of the surrounding forest. Tree positions, trails, and notes on landmarks, all mapped in precise but gentle hand. A trail continued from the lake, climbing toward a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley. The stones here were smooth, worn by wind and rain. A circle of flat rocks had been arranged at the edge, just inside the reach of the overhanging cliff. Within, a small collection of feathers, each a different color, rested. No one had been seen here recently, yet the arrangement seemed intentional, patient, and precise. Below the outcrop, a narrow stream curved through the valley floor. Along its banks, small notches had been carved into tree trunks, subtle markers almost invisible from a distance. Pebbles had been placed in small, deliberate piles beside the water, forming lines that suggested a pattern, a quiet code only perceptible to someone willing to linger and notice. Across the valley, a dirt road wound toward a long-abandoned fire lookout tower. Its ladder was rusted but climbed steadily to the platform above. From the top, the view stretched across forest and hills, a panorama of stillness. Inside the small shelter at the summit, a single chair faced the horizon, and a journal rested on the floor. Its pages contained notes in careful, looping script, observations of animals, weather patterns, and the subtle rhythms of the surrounding landscape. A path from the lookout led to an overgrown orchard, trees heavy with unpicked fruit. Beneath one tree, a small, sealed envelope had been tucked into the roots. Its paper was aged but intact. Inside, faint handwriting traced a sequence of numbers and letters, carefully spaced, almost as if meant for someone to discover slowly, to puzzle over in quiet reflection. Nearby, a winding trail led into a grove of maples. The leaves, tinged with the last colors of autumn, rustled softly with each step. Along the path, stones had been arranged at regular intervals, flat and smooth, leading toward a low hill. At the hilltop, A small stone bench faced the horizon, moss creeping along its edges. On it, a tiny bundle of twigs and leaves had been carefully stacked, deliberate yet fragile, waiting to be noticed by patient eyes. The investigators traced the forest path further, reaching a narrow canyon where a small wooden bridge crossed a quiet stream. Water trickled over stones, soft and rhythmic. On the far side, a low stone wall ran along the edge, overgrown with ivy. At intervals, small carvings had been etched into the stone. Symbols, letters, shapes, patterns that hinted at meaning but resisted immediate understanding. Beyond the canyon, the trail opened into a wide meadow. The grass swayed gently in the evening breeze, and wildflowers dotted the edges. A small abandoned cabin rested near the center, its roof patched with mismatched boards. Inside, a table held a series of envelopes, each carefully labeled with dates and locations, their contents hidden. Along the floorboards, faint scratches traced slow, deliberate paths, as if someone had moved methodically across the space, leaving invisible messages for an unseen observer. At the edge of the meadow, a narrow stream led to a series of stone steps climbing toward an old, abandoned water tower. Rust streaked the metal, and the ladder groaned softly with each careful step. At the top, a panoramic view of forest, hills, and the distant village unfolded. On a small platform, a notebook lay open, pages filled with looping script, detailed observations, and small diagrams of the terrain. Each mark seemed deliberate, patient, as if documenting patterns invisible to the casual passerby. A thin path from the tower led to a small cluster of remote cabins tucked among tall firs. Smoke curled faintly from one chimney, though the surrounding buildings appeared empty. Along the path, faint traces of footprints pressed into the soft earth, moving slowly in loops, disappearing into brush and returning, as though someone had walked the trail carefully, deliberately, over and over. Near the cabins, a narrow boardwalk led into a boggy area. Moss and reeds lined the edges, soft and pliant underfoot. Small stones and pieces of driftwood had been arranged in subtle patterns along the walkway. A single, weathered lantern sat on a stump, unlit but polished. The arrangement suggested patient attention, a quiet ritual, or marking left to be discovered slowly. A short climb beyond the bog led to a ridge overlooking a quiet valley. At the edge, a stone circle lay, moss-covered but intact. Inside, small tokens rested, leaves, feathers, and pieces of bark, each placed carefully. The air was still, carrying only the distant rustle of trees and the faint whisper of wind. The scene felt deliberate, a silent message preserved in the soft, patient rhythm of the landscape. A trail descended from the ridge toward a narrow creek. Along the bank, small wooden stakes had been positioned at intervals, their tops smoothed and polished. Nearby, an old rowboat rested among reeds, oars tucked neatly inside. Pebbles in the shallow water had been arranged in lines and arcs, suggesting intention, a quiet story unfolding in soft, deliberate gestures. The path continued, winding through a low forest of cedar and spruce. Along it, a small, abandoned ranger cabin appeared, its door ajar. Inside, a shelf held jars filled with soil samples, mosses, and small twigs, each labeled with precise dates. A notebook lay open, pages filled with careful observations, gentle notes on light, wind, and the quiet behaviors of animals. Each detail seemed chosen for careful reflection, a slow accumulation of patterns, waiting for patient eyes to notice. The forest thinned gradually, giving way to a narrow, gravel road lined with wildflowers and low, rolling hills. A faint scent of damp earth and pine lingered in the air. Along the roadside, an old mailbox stood crooked, its red paint chipped and faded. Inside, a small bundle of folded letters rested, tied with string. The envelopes were yellowed, edges soft, and the ink inside had faded, yet someone had taken care to leave them neatly stacked. A short distance down the road, a weathered barn appeared, its timbers gray and swollen from years of rain. The large doors were slightly open, and inside, a faint scent of hay mingled with the mustiness of disuse. On a low beam, a single horseshoe was nailed, polished to a subtle shine. Beneath it, scattered pieces of broken pottery lay, arranged almost deliberately, as though someone had paused to place them carefully. Beyond the barn, a footpath led toward a small pond, its surface mirror-smooth in the late afternoon light. Around its edges, reeds swayed gently in a breeze too soft to rustle the leaves of the surrounding trees. On one side, a narrow wooden dock extended into the water, boards warped but intact. At the end of the dock, a simple bucket lay on its side, water inside reflecting the sky. Small, barely visible scratches marked the surface of the wood, faint evidence of repeated, careful movement. A trail from the pond led into a dense grove of aspens. The light here was muted, filtered through trembling leaves, and the forest floor was soft with fallen foliage. At the base of a large tree, a small carved symbol rested, subtle and precise. Nearby, a collection of tiny stones had been stacked, balanced in delicate piles. Every arrangement felt intentional yet quiet, as if left for someone patient enough to notice the subtleties of the place. Following the trail further, a series of abandoned cottages appeared, leaning gently under the weight of time. Their windows were dark, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke long extinguished. One doorway led to a small room with a table covered in folded cloths, each carefully arranged. In the corner, a single lantern rested, unlit but polished, reflecting the last light of day in soft, muted glimmers. Beyond the cottages, the trail opened to a clearing where a narrow creek ran, winding between low, moss-covered stones. A small wooden footbridge crossed the water, its boards creaking softly under the weight of careful footsteps. Along the bank, a series of pebbles had been arranged in gentle arcs, leading toward a fallen log. On the log, a bundle of sticks and leaves had been placed deliberately, forming a subtle, quiet pattern. Across the creek, a remote cabin appeared, partially hidden among firs. Its roof sagged slightly, and the smoke from its chimney was faint but present. Around the cabin, the grass had been cut in uneven patches, creating a soft, undulating pattern. A single bench faced the edge of the forest, and on it, a notebook lay open, pages filled with looping, careful handwriting. The notes described subtle shifts in the landscape, patterns of bird flight, and changes in the wind across the hills. From the cabin, a narrow dirt road led toward a small lake nestled in a shallow valley. The water was calm, its surface reflecting the muted colors of the sky. At the far edge, a wooden dock extended over the lake, its boards uneven but stable. Resting on the dock was a crate, closed and weathered. Inside, delicate sketches of trees, streams, and hills were layered atop one another, carefully labeled with dates and locations. A trail from the lake climbed toward a ridge where a small, stone lookout stood, its walls coated with moss. From the platform, the forest stretched endlessly, quiet and still. On the ledge, A journal lay open, its pages filled with meticulous observations, patterns of shadows, the soft ripple of water, the gentle sway of trees in the wind. Each entry was dated, some recent, some older, all written in the same slow, deliberate hand. Beyond the lookout, a winding path led to a hidden orchard, trees heavy with unpicked fruit. Beneath one tree, a small bundle of twigs and leaves had been carefully arranged. Nearby, faint tracks pressed into the soft earth, looping in gentle arcs. The arrangement suggested attention, patience, and a quiet intent to leave subtle marks in a world otherwise still. A few minutes' walk beyond the orchard brought the investigators to a series of low hills. Between them, a small stone structure crouched, almost swallowed by moss and brush. Its door was ajar, revealing a dark interior. Inside, wooden shelves held jars filled with soil, moss, and small leaves, each labeled carefully. A notebook rested on the counter, pages filled with careful sketches and notes, documenting every small detail of the surrounding landscape with patient precision. From the stone structure, a trail led to a meadow dotted with wildflowers and tall grasses. In the center, a low wooden platform had been built, boards smooth and unweathered. On it, a collection of small stones, feathers, and leaves had been arranged in a subtle pattern. The breeze moved through the meadow, rustling the arrangement softly, creating quiet movement in the stillness. A path from the meadow led to a narrow creek winding through a grove of birch and maple. Along its banks, small stakes had been placed at regular intervals, each smoothed and polished. Nearby, a weathered rowboat rested among reeds, oars tucked neatly inside. The water flowed quietly, ripples forming gentle patterns across the surface, reflecting a world untouched but subtly shaped by careful hands. At the far edge of the grove, a low hill rose, crowned with a small wooden cabin. Its windows were fogged, and the roof sagged slightly. Inside, a table held a series of envelopes, each labeled with dates and locations, their contents hidden. Along the floorboards, faint scratches traced slow, deliberate paths, as if someone had moved carefully across the space, leaving invisible marks for anyone observant enough to notice. From the cabin, a narrow trail led into dense forest where tall pines swayed gently in the wind. Along the path, a small lantern rested on a stump, polished and unlit. Beside it, tiny stones had been stacked carefully, and a bundle of leaves and twigs arranged in deliberate order. Each detail seemed intentional yet quiet, a subtle rhythm of presence in the soft, undisturbed forest. Beyond the pines, a low ridge appeared, overlooking a wide valley. At the edge, a stone circle lay, moss-covered but intact. Inside, small tokens, leaves, feathers, and bark had been placed with careful attention. The valley below stretched quiet and still, the only sounds the distant rustle of trees and the whisper of wind. The arrangement spoke of patience, observation, and a slow, deliberate presence in the natural world. A path descended from the ridge toward a narrow creek lined with moss-covered stones. Along its banks, tiny stakes had been placed, their tops polished. Pebbles in the shallow water were arranged in lines and arcs, forming patterns that were subtle but deliberate. At the water's edge, a small wooden box rested, its lid closed but edges worn smooth, suggesting careful handling over time. The trail continued through a grove of fir and cedar. Along it, a small abandoned ranger station appeared, its door ajar. Inside, shelves held jars of soil, moss, and twigs, each labeled precisely. A notebook lay open, pages filled with careful observations of light, wind, and the movements of wildlife. Each entry was measured, precise, and patient, a record of quiet observation awaiting someone willing to notice. From the ranger station, the path led to a low hill overlooking a narrow river. The water flowed softly, reflecting the muted light of early evening. On a wooden bench at the edge of the hill, a bundle of twigs, leaves, and small feathers rested, arranged carefully. The surrounding forest stood still, the breeze moving only gently through the trees, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and pine. A faint trail led down from the hill to a small dock by the river. Weathered boards extended into the calm water, and a rowboat rested nearby, oars tucked inside. Along the dock's edge, small scratches marred the wood, forming subtle, deliberate patterns. The river flowed quietly, each ripple reflecting fragments of sky and forest, the world moving slowly and softly under the gaze of careful observation. As night fell, the investigators sat quietly on the edge of the dock, letting their gaze drift across the still water. The river reflected the muted glow of a pale moon, ripples moving softly with the faintest of breezes. One of them traced the subtle scratches on the boards with a finger, noticing the repeated arcs and careful spacing. Slowly, it occurred to them that these markings were not random. They were patterns, gentle guides through the landscape, left deliberately by someone who had moved through it with care. The notebooks and journals collected from the cabins, the ranger station, and the hilltop lookouts began to feel connected. Each contained observations of light, wind, water, and movement, details that at first seemed incidental but now formed a quiet map of the area. Footpaths, small piles of stones, and bundles of leaves and twigs were not mere happenstance. They were part of a slow, deliberate record, a way of marking presence and noticing the world in a patient, attentive manner. Walking through the forest the following morning, the investigators followed the subtle markers they had begun to recognize: stacks of stones, faint notches on tree trunks, and carefully arranged twigs. Each led naturally to the next, guiding them to small clearings, abandoned cabins, and overlooked ponds. With every discovery, the feeling grew that someone had been moving through these spaces quietly, almost invisibly, leaving hints not for urgency, but for understanding. Returning to the village, they spoke with the cafe owner again. She remembered an elderly local who had walked the forests daily, noting patterns in nature and occasionally sharing observations with a few patient neighbors. He had lived alone near the hills, rarely seen, but always felt present through the trails and markers he left behind. His habits now seemed to illuminate the small, intentional arrangements. Each bundle of sticks, each circle of stones, and each meticulous journal entry was an extension of his quiet attentiveness. The bicycle at the bridge, the first strange discovery, now began to make sense in a subtle way. It had been left there, half hidden, to mark a crossing point, one of the many gentle signals tracing his movements through the valley. The investigators realized the small details that had puzzled them: the feathers, the pebbles, the careful stacking of driftwood, were not messages of alarm or danger. They were invitations to observe, to notice, and to move slowly through the environment with awareness, a meditation in form rather than a puzzle demanding immediate solution. They returned to the old boathouse by the river, tracing the arcs of scratches on the floorboards and the arrangement of ropes and nets. Here, the purpose became clear in its subtlety. The repeated patterns mirrored paths through the forest, paths that avoided damage to sensitive plants, that led safely around marshes, and that highlighted overlooked beauty in the quiet landscape. Each small clue was part of a mindful way of existing, a slow choreography of presence in the natural world. By mid-morning, they climbed to the stone lookout on the ridge once more. Sitting on the platform, flipping through the journals, they saw that every observation, the placement of stones, the arrangement of sticks, the sketches of the hills, trees, and streams, was consistent. Each entry recorded not just the environment, but the gentle passage of time and attention. The realization settled quietly. This was a record of presence, an intimate conversation between a single, patient observer and the land itself. Returning to the orchard, the investigators noticed the bundles beneath the trees anew. They were not random objects. They were markers of paths taken, points where someone had paused, reflected, and acknowledged the subtle rhythms of the natural world. Even the footprints looping softly in the soil seemed less like traces of disappearance and more like gestures of careful movement, a deliberate attention to the landscape, each step measured, each pause significant. They walked the trail through the grove of maples, recognizing the deliberate patterns of stones, twigs, and feathers for what they were, quiet milestones of observation. With each circle and arc, the intention became more apparent. This was a map of mindfulness, a record of presence over weeks, months, and years, layered into the forest with patient care. At the edge of the meadow, they paused at the low wooden platform where small tokens had been arranged. Sunlight touched the feathers and leaves, soft shadows stretching across the grass. For the first time, the investigators felt the rhythm of the work, a slow, reflective practice, not a puzzle, not a disappearance, but a gentle dedication to noticing the world and leaving a trace that could be discovered slowly, quietly, and without urgency. Standing on the ridge above the creek, they traced the polished stakes and arranged pebbles. It became clear that every small act, every journal entry, every carefully folded letter, every stone stack and twig bundle was part of a single, patient consciousness moving through the valley. The forest, ponds, ridges, and abandoned structures were its canvas, and the markers were quiet invitations for others to enter that calm, measured awareness. As evening fell, the investigators returned to the dock by the river, the water still and reflective. Sitting in silence, they saw the bicycle, the journals, the bundles of sticks, the circles of stones, and the small, folded letters not as mysterious threats, but as gentle guidance. Everything that had seemed strange or unexplained now felt coherent, a slowly unfolding meditation that had left traces for anyone willing to move quietly, observe attentively, and notice the subtleties of a world often overlooked. With the moon rising, the valley rested in calm stillness. The gentle breeze moved through trees, ripples on the river glimmered faintly, and shadows stretched soft and slow across the land. The investigators understood, in quiet reflection, that the mystery was not a puzzle to be solved but a slow, patient record of presence, a dialogue between a single attentive observer and the world they moved through with care. Every marker, every note, every subtle arrangement was a meditation left behind, waiting to be quietly recognized by those who would take the time to notice. And as the night deepened, the valley seemed to breathe softly, carrying with it the gentle traces of the observer who had walked its paths. The investigators felt the quiet rhythm of it all, the deliberate patience, the attentive eye, and the calm continuity stretching across trails, forests, and rivers, a slow, reflective understanding settling over them. like the soft hush of a river at dusk. Case 2. Rain fell in fine, steady threads over the weathered rooftops of a village tucked against the curve of a distant mountain range. It was a place where the morning fog lingered long into the day, curling around moss-covered fences and the stone walls of cottages that had seen generations pass quietly by. Along the main lane, a small notice board swayed slightly in the damp breeze, and on it, a single photograph had been pinned, old and fading, of a wooden rowboat, empty and half-sunken near the far side of the lake. No name, no date, just the quiet suggestion of something left behind. The lake itself was calm, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple from a drifting leaf or a slow-falling raindrop. From the shore, the water seemed to stretch endlessly into the soft mist, where distant trees blurred into ghostly shapes. A solitary dock jutted out like a forgotten finger into the gray water, the wood swollen and dark with dampness, creaking faintly whenever the wind whispered through the reeds. An investigator arrived by the narrow, winding road that led down from the hills. The tires of the small car made little sound on the wet asphalt, and the occasional splash of a puddle was the only disturbance in the heavy silence. He parked near the edge of town, where the cottages ended and the forest began, and looked over the lake. The air carried a damp, earthy scent, punctuated by the faint tang of something older, stone, water, and decay. Walking along the dock, he noticed a small, dark shape beneath the water's surface. At first, it seemed to be nothing more than a tangle of reeds, but as he squatted closer, the outline suggested a chest, wooden, with iron fittings, quietly submerged just beneath the surface. The water was still enough that its edges could be traced, the wood warped and slick with moss. He marked the spot carefully, noting its position and the way the sunlight barely penetrated the mist to touch it. Over the following days, he explored the village, moving slowly through narrow alleyways and quiet lanes where laundry hung damp and motionless between the houses. The villagers spoke softly, often pausing before answering questions, their voices mingling with the distant drip of water from eaves and gutters. Some remembered the rowboat in the photograph. Others insisted it had never been there, or that it belonged to someone long gone. Every recollection seemed to shift slightly depending on the time of day, the light, or the mood of the speaker. In an abandoned mill by the stream, he found the first hint of connection. The building had once ground grain for the village, but now its windows were clouded, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Inside, a narrow staircase led to a loft, where bundles of old records and ledgers had been stacked carefully, dust-laden but surprisingly intact. One ledger listed a series of small payments, deliveries of timber and rope, and on the margins, faint annotations in a delicate hand, dates, initials, and the word lake repeated at intervals. The ink was faded, the lines wavering slightly as if the writer's hand had trembled with some quiet apprehension. The surrounding forest seemed to lean inward as he followed its winding paths. Moss covered nearly every stone, and the fog hugged the ground so closely that it was easy to lose sight of the trail. He came across a cabin tucked between two leaning pines, its roof sagging and chimney long and used. Inside, the air smelled of wet wood and forgotten smoke. A small writing desk held a scattered collection of letters, yellowed and curled at the edges. Many spoke of journeys to the lake, mentions of a boat, and fleeting references to someone who would meet there at dusk. The words hinted at anticipation, perhaps secrecy, but always in hushed tones. He returned to the dock late in the evening. Mist had thickened over the water, softening its edges until it felt less like a boundary and more like a gentle invitation to step forward. A lone lantern hung from a post near the far end, casting a warm, trembling circle of light across the boards. The faint reflection of the lamp shimmered on the water, revealing the outline of the submerged chest more clearly than ever. It seemed to hold stillness within it, as though it had been waiting quietly for someone to notice. Exploration of the surrounding hills brought him to a narrow trail that wound up toward a high ridge. From there, the lake lay below, its surface a mirror of gray and silver under the overcast sky. The land around it was sparsely populated. Cottages dotted the shoreline, and a small chapel sat in isolation near the northern edge, its steeple piercing the fog. He wandered along the trail, taking note of hollows where water had pooled, old stone fences nearly swallowed by ivy, and the quiet hum of insects that somehow persisted even in the damp chill. In the chapel, the wooden pews were worn smooth, and the air carried a faint fragrance of candle wax and damp stone. Beneath the altar, a hidden compartment held a collection of trinkets, a rusted key, a small leather-bound book, a silver locket with initials engraved. Each seemed carefully placed, undisturbed for decades. The locket contained a photograph of the same rowboat, tiny and delicate, resting in the water as though it had been waiting for someone to remember it. Returning to the village, he visited a small, quiet bakery at the edge of town. The owner, a woman in her 70s, spoke softly of mornings when she would see someone rowing the lake alone, their silhouette reflected perfectly in the mist. Sometimes the figure lingered near the dock, sometimes near the far shore, always silent, always alone. Her words were calm, almost meditative, and the way she described it suggested that this quiet presence had been part of the rhythm of the village for years. Later, he traced a narrow dirt road that ran along the far side of the lake. Old, weathered signs marked the way to abandoned cabins and small farmhouses. Among the tall grasses and scattered stones, he found a circle of flattened reeds, almost imperceptible from a distance. It suggested that something or someone had paused here repeatedly, leaving traces in the quietest of ways. Nearby, a small, forgotten pier jutted into the water, its wood dark and slick, a mirror to the main dock across the lake. Evenings were spent with his notes, cross-referencing ledger entries with letters, mapping the cabins and trails, and observing the shifting fog that rolled in from the hills. Each night, the lake seemed to breathe in its own slow rhythm, waves barely lapping against the shores, a quiet pulse that suggested patience and waiting. He found a rhythm to the mystery itself, a soft unfolding of connections, hints, and whispers in the environment that spoke louder than words ever could. One morning, he wandered into the dense reeds along the southern edge of the lake. The water here was shallow, and the reeds swayed gently, brushing against his ankles. Amidst them, he noticed something small and metallic, reflecting a stray shaft of light. It was a simple clasp, tarnished by time, perhaps part of the chest's original lock. Nearby, a faint trail of footprints had been preserved in the soft mud, small, deliberate, almost ritualistic. They led neither far nor wide, but suggested intention and care. The mountains around the village held a persistent quiet, broken only by distant bird calls or the occasional rustle of wind through pines. Trails wound past rock faces and small waterfalls, each location holding subtle signs of passage, a forgotten hat on a boulder, a string tied to a branch as a marker, a cluster of small stones carefully arranged. Each seemed insignificant alone, but together They whispered of someone who moved deliberately through the terrain, marking time and presence in understated ways. At the far end of the lake, near a grove of alder trees, he found a boathouse almost entirely hidden by overgrowth. Its roof had collapsed, and vines crept through the timbers, softening its angles. Inside, scattered papers lay damp, the ink running faintly with moisture, yet legible enough to suggest a careful record of trips to the dock, names of people who had once rowed across the water, and entries noting observations of the lake's quiet moods. Night fell, bringing a heavier mist that rolled across the water and through the village. Lanterns flickered along the main lane, their reflections stretching across puddles like calm trails of gold. From the dock, the lake seemed endless, a soft expanse of gray where the line between water and sky dissolved. Somewhere beneath its surface, the chest rested quietly, unchanged by the passage of years, holding secrets that had been waiting for patient eyes and gentle curiosity. He continued to follow subtle trails along the shoreline and into the forested hills, taking note of small details. A knife handle protruding from mud near the bank, a rope frayed and coiled beside a tree stump, footprints that stopped abruptly at the water's edge. Each was catalogued, considered, and left to sit quietly in memory, forming a tapestry of intention and presence that was more felt than seen. In the village archives, he discovered old maps showing paths and docks no longer in use. Faded annotations marked points of interest: submerged, rowboat, meeting place. The handwriting varied, some entries precise, others faint and uncertain, as though time itself had blurred intention. These maps, alongside letters and ledgers, created a web of small, quiet connections, slowly revealing the rhythm of events across the years. He walked along the northern trail at dawn, mist hanging low among the pine trunks. Every step was deliberate, each sound muted by the wet earth. Alongside the trail, small markers of human presence appeared: scattered nails, a fragment of rope, a carved symbol on a tree. The trail wound steadily toward the edge of the forest, then looped back to the water, suggesting a routine, a repeated path, observed over long stretches of time. Near the edge of the village cemetery, where stones leaned under moss and years, he found another subtle clue: a gravestone with a barely legible name, the epitaph noting a date that coincided with a ledger entry. Near its base lay a small wooden charm, weathered but intentionally placed, almost unnoticed among the overgrowth. It seemed to connect the resting place to the lake and the dock, a quiet, deliberate line of thought spanning years, unnoticed by most. Even the wind played a role in the unfolding mystery. Gentle gusts through the reeds along the lake seemed to mimic whispers, moving through hollow spaces in the abandoned cabins and the empty chapel. Each sound suggested a presence, or perhaps memory, lingering in place. Observing these subtleties required patience and attention, allowing the environment itself to guide the quiet understanding of events long past. By the late afternoon, the investigator returned once more to the main dock. The water shimmered under the low sun, and distant hills blurred with mist. He traced the lines of the submerged chest again, noting the position of the reeds, the flow of the water, the gentle rocking of the dock. Every observation added another layer to the quiet puzzle, and the rhythm of the lake seemed to echo the pace of his thoughts, slow, deliberate, patient, and attentive to the faintest signs of the past. Along the east shore, he found a small, overgrown trail leading to a field where wildflowers had grown unchecked. Among them were remnants of old tents and camping equipment, almost invisible under layers of green. A faint smell of damp canvas lingered. Here, someone had clearly spent time, marking the environment in subtle ways. Sticks arranged in patterns, stones placed in small circles, shallow depressions suggesting repeated visits. Returning to the abandoned mill, he discovered more old ledgers tucked beneath floorboards, their pages damp but readable. Entries detailed boat trips, deliveries, and notes about the lake's changing currents. Occasional sketches of the shoreline appeared in the margins, faint lines suggesting careful observation over long periods. The handwriting shifted in tone between entries, some meticulous, some hurried, some uncertain, offering glimpses into the mind that had recorded these quiet actions. The forest at dusk was alive with muted sounds, the distant flap of wings, the soft rustle of leaves, the quiet burble of a small creek. Following its path led to a stone bridge, moss-covered and worn, under which water whispered over pebbles. Beneath the bridge, he discovered a small collection of driftwood arranged as if to mark a passage or act as a signal, subtle enough to be missed unless one walked slowly, with eyes attuned to the gentle patterns of the environment. At the farthest edge of the village, a narrow dirt path led to a clearing with a single, twisted oak. Beneath its branches lay fragments of pottery and glass, smoothed by time. Each piece seemed deliberately placed, perhaps as markers or reminders, echoing the quiet attention to detail found elsewhere. Sunlight filtered through the fog and branches, casting muted shadows that danced slowly across the ground. Along the western shoreline, reeds gave way to small inlets where water pooled quietly. A faint line of small, deliberate footprints ran along the edge, stopping at points where the observer had left stones or bits of driftwood. It was as if someone had been quietly mapping the perimeter for years, leaving hints only for those who moved slowly enough to notice. Evenings in the village brought a stillness that was almost tangible. Lanterns flickered in windows, smoke curled from chimneys, and the lake's surface reflected clouds tinged with pink and gray. The dock, the submerged chest, the abandoned cabins, the letters, and the ledgers all seemed to settle into a shared rhythm, waiting, quietly, for the investigator to perceive the subtle connections that bound them together. Along the ridge above the lake, a faint path wound through bracken and pine. He followed it slowly, noting small indentations in the soil, occasional scuff marks on rocks, and glimpses of the water below through the thinning trees. Every observation layered on the last, a slow accumulation of understanding that suggested deliberate movement, patience, and quiet intention over long periods of time. At the small, deserted chapel near the northern edge of the lake, he noticed the bell rope swaying gently despite the absence of wind. It was a quiet, inexplicable motion, echoing the subtle mysteries of the place itself. The pews bore marks where someone had rested their hands or knelt, faint impressions that whispered of repeated gestures, patience, and attention to ritual. He wandered to the far east dock at dawn, mist curling over the water like tendrils of quiet smoke. The lake's surface was perfectly still, broken only by occasional ripples from hidden fish or a gentle breeze. The submerged chest's outline shimmered beneath the water, the wood dark and mottled. Around it, reeds whispered, bending gently as if in acknowledgement of long-held secrets, their movements slow and rhythmic. Near the edge of a small forest clearing, he discovered a simple wooden box, partially buried beneath leaves. Its surface was worn and damp, the edges softened by years of exposure. Inside lay a series of small, carefully folded papers, each containing brief notes about trips across the lake, names of individuals, and subtle observations about the rhythm of the environment. They were quiet, deliberate, and measured, like the movements of someone attuned to patience and secrecy. Walking along the southern path at twilight, he found a cluster of rocks arranged in a subtle pattern near the water's edge. They were almost invisible from a distance, but placed deliberately, perhaps as markers or reminders. The reeds nearby bent softly in the evening breeze, creating a faint rustling that harmonized with the gentle lapping of water against the shore. He returned to the dock for the final observation of the day. The mist had thickened to a soft curtain across the lake, obscuring the far shore entirely. Lantern light reflected in faint, trembling streaks across the water, revealing the outline of the submerged chest once more. Every element, the reeds, the gentle ripples, the dock itself, the soft hum of the forest, seemed to breathe in unison, a slow, quiet rhythm that encouraged attention, reflection, and patient understanding. Along the northern trail, hidden beneath moss and bracken, he discovered a single shoe, partially buried. It was small, worn, and placed with care rather than lost accidentally. Nearby, subtle depressions suggested repeated visits to the same spot, perhaps to check on something left behind, or to observe the lake from that precise vantage. At the edge of the village, an old fishing shed revealed more hints. Rusted hooks, frayed nets, and a ledger listing times, dates, and locations for various trips. Marginal notes mentioned the dock, the submerged chest, and individuals who had been observed quietly across the lake over the years. Each entry was restrained, factual, and understated, leaving the reader to fill in the quiet, careful intentions behind them. The fog rolled in thick that evening, wrapping the village, the lake, and the hills beyond in a soft gray veil. Lanterns flickered along the main lane, their light barely cutting through the damp air. The dock and chest remained in their quiet place beneath the water, waiting, as if they had always existed there simply for observation, patient, still, and unhurried. He wandered through the forest paths again, noting moss-covered stones, fallen branches arranged with subtle care, and the gentle patterns of wind and rain through the leaves. Everything moved slowly here. The water, the mist, the trees, and each small discovery became part of a rhythm, a quiet story that unfolded in measured, deliberate increments. Near the chapel, the bell rope moved again, swaying gently without reason. The pews bore faint impressions of hands and knees, and the floorboards creaked softly underfoot. Outside, the lake mirrored the sky, still and gray, and the submerged chest rested calmly beneath the surface, its contours softened by water, reeds, and time. At the edge of the lake, he found another small marker, a simple, carved wooden stick pushed into the mud. Its placement was precise, deliberate, echoing the careful attention seen elsewhere. Around it, footprints suggested repeated visits, quiet observations, and a deliberate patience that had spanned years. The village, the forest, the lake, and the hills all seemed to exhale together as night fell. Lanterns flickered in windows, the wind whispered through reeds and pines, and the water reflected the fading light of day. In this calm, deliberate rhythm, every clue, trace, and mark existed quietly, patiently waiting for the careful observer to notice, understand, and follow the soft unfolding of what had quietly occurred across time and space. Along the southern path, near a small grove, he found fragments of a journal, partially rotted but legible enough to read. They contained brief observations about weather, lake conditions, and visits to the dock. Each entry was understated, almost meditative, describing the quiet passage of days and the slow, deliberate attention to small details that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. In the distant hills, he noticed patterns in the forest canopy, faint breaks where sunlight touched the ground, trails that suggested passage, and small clearings that seemed carefully maintained. Each hinted at repeated visits, subtle rituals, and attention to natural rhythms. Walking slowly, observing quietly, he traced these signs as if reading a language written in the landscape itself. At the dock, the lantern swayed, gently in the evening breeze, casting flickering light across the boards. The chest beneath the water remained calm and still, its surface dark and softened. Every element, the water, the mist, the dock, the reeds, the wind, seemed to participate in a quiet, deliberate rhythm, waiting for the observer to perceive the subtle connections that stretched across time, space, and memory. He followed a narrow stream from the hills back toward the lake. Its waters were clear, reflecting the muted colors of the sky, the surrounding moss, and the branches that arched overhead. Along its banks were small arrangements of stones, hints of repeated observation and care, almost imperceptible unless one walked slowly and noticed each subtle detail. Near the edge of a small meadow, he found a faint impression of a boat dragged across soft ground, leading toward the lake. The marks were shallow, almost erased by time, but deliberate and intentional. Alongside them were scattered pieces of rope and timber, remnants of careful activity performed quietly and deliberately. The lake, shrouded in evening mist, seemed to hold a pulse of its own. Gentle ripples moved across the surface, reeds swayed slowly, and the submerged chest remained calm, as if breathing with the rhythm of the environment. Each observation layered onto the last, forming a soft, intricate tapestry of subtle clues and quiet intention. He traced a faint footpath along the northern ridge. The soil bore impressions of repeated passage, leaves pressed flat where someone had lingered, small arrangements of sticks and stones marking precise points. Each element suggested patience, care, and a measured approach, as if every movement had been considered and performed with intent over long periods. At the edge of the forest, a small stone wall marked the boundary of a long-forgotten garden. Within it, moss and ferns grew unchecked, but careful inspection revealed footprints leading to the water, faint trails suggesting someone had come and gone here repeatedly. Small items, twigs, stones, and fragments of pottery were arranged deliberately, subtle signals embedded in the quiet landscape. Near the dock, the water reflected the muted colors of dusk. The chest beneath the surface remained undisturbed, partially obscured by reeds and the soft rhythm of waves. Every observation, every small clue, every trace in the mud, stone, or forest seemed to align into a slow, deliberate pattern, inviting patience and careful attention. Walking along a trail toward the eastern hills, he noticed faint markings on tree trunks, scratches, carvings, and subtle symbols. They were almost imperceptible, yet suggested repeated presence and quiet documentation of passage. Beneath them, leaves had been disturbed in subtle ways, echoing the deliberate, patient rhythm that threaded through the environment. The village itself remained quiet into the late evening. Lanterns glimmered in the fog, smoke curled from chimneys, and the lake mirrored the muted glow of the sky. The dock and submerged chest persisted, still and calm, as if time had folded around them, holding them in place, waiting for the careful observer to perceive the quiet interconnections stretching across decades. At the far edge of the forest, he found a small grove where stones had been arranged in concentric circles. They were partially hidden by moss, ferns, and fallen branches, but their deliberate placement suggested observation and ritual. Around them, faint trails led toward the lake, the dock, and the abandoned cabins, forming a quiet network of markers across the landscape. He paused on a ridge above the lake as mist rolled gently across the water. The forest stretched in every direction, quiet and still, each detail, trees, stones, paths, reeds, holding subtle evidence of past presence. The chest beneath the dock remained undisturbed, the water calm and reflective, as the rhythm of observation, patience, and quiet care continued to unfold across the landscape. Along the southern shore, near a small inlet, he found remnants of rope and wood, arranged as though to guide movement or mark a location. The impressions in the mud suggested repeated visits, slow and deliberate steps, attentive to subtle patterns in the environment. Every element, the water, reeds, trees, and soft wind, participated in a quiet, rhythmic unfolding of events. At the village edge, an old shed revealed further traces. Hooks, small tools, and fragments of leather carefully stored. Marginal notes in a ledger mentioned trips across the lake, observations of the dock, and subtle markers left in the forest. Each entry, understated and deliberate, added to the growing tapestry of patient, quiet action woven across the village, forest, and lake. The mist thickened as night fell, wrapping the hills, forest, and lake in a soft gray veil. Lanterns flickered in windows, water rippled gently against the dock, and the chest remained calm beneath the surface. Every observation, every trace of presence, every small detail in the environment became part of a slow, deliberate rhythm, waiting patiently for understanding. Along the ridge to the east, he noticed subtle signs of passage, flattened grasses, disturbed leaves, and small arrangements of stones marking specific points. Each suggested careful attention, repeated observation, and deliberate placement over time. The rhythm of movement, reflection, and patience persisted throughout the forest, across the lake, and into the quiet village beyond. At the small chapel, the bell rope moved softly again, as if acknowledging the subtle patterns of activity around it. Few impressions, faint marks on the floor, and the gentle sway of hanging lanterns contributed to a quiet, deliberate tapestry of observation and care. Outside, the lake mirrored the dim sky, the dock and chest remaining still, serene, and patient. Near a grove on the northern shore, he discovered a small cluster of sticks arranged deliberately. Around them, faint traces suggested repeated visits, careful observation, and measured interaction with the environment. The reeds swayed gently in the evening breeze, adding soft whispers to the quiet, unfolding mystery. The forest paths, lake shores, and village lanes continued to reveal subtle traces, footprints, arranged stones, faintly marked trees, and remnants of rope and wood. Each element added to the quiet, slow rhythm of events, patience, and deliberate observation, forming an intricate tapestry that required attention, care, and time to perceive fully. At the dock, the water reflected the muted colors of dusk, the chest remaining calm beneath the surface. Reeds whispered in the wind, the lantern swayed softly, and the faint hum of insects and distant birds underscored the slow, deliberate unfolding of observations, traces, and quiet mysteries across the lake, forest, and village. Along the eastern ridge, he noticed faint impressions of repeated passage through the moss and fallen leaves. Small stones, twigs, and fragments of pottery marked specific points, each arranged with care. The rhythm of movement, observation, and patient attention continued to weave a quiet, deliberate pattern across the landscape. The village remained still under the soft glow of lanterns. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, water lapped gently against docks, and the chest beneath the lake remained undisturbed. Every trace, every small detail, and every subtle pattern contributed to a slow, immersive rhythm of quiet observation and patient investigation. At the forest edge, near a small meadow, he discovered remnants of a journal, partially rotted but still legible. Observations about the lake, dock, and surrounding trails were recorded with calm, measured attention. Each entry offered insight into the slow, deliberate actions that had taken place over years, echoing the rhythm of the environment itself. Walking along the northern shore, he found faint impressions of a small boat dragged across soft mud. Nearby, carefully arranged stones and scattered pieces of rope suggested repeated, deliberate visits. The quiet rhythm of water, reeds, forest, and village formed an intricate pattern that unfolded slowly, demanding patient attention to perceive. At the far edge of the village, the old fishing shed contained further hints: rusted hooks, frayed nets, and meticulous notes of trips, observations, and subtle markers. Each item reinforced the deliberate, patient pattern of activity that spanned the lake, forest, and village. The fog rolled in thick as night fell. Lanterns flickered along quiet streets. The lake mirrored the muted sky, and the chest beneath the dock remained still. Every element, the reeds, water, forest, village, and hills, participated in a slow, deliberate rhythm of patient observation, subtle clues, and quiet mystery, waiting for continued attention and careful, deliberate understanding. He rose early, the fog still heavy over the lake, and walked along a narrow dirt road that led toward a stretch of forest the locals rarely visited. The trees here were tall and straight, their trunks pale in the gray light, and the undergrowth was thick with ferns and moss. Small clearings appeared at intervals, each containing remnants of human presence: a weathered bench, a broken lantern, a tangle of rope, or the faint outline of a fire pit long extinguished. At the edge of one clearing, an abandoned ranger station emerged from the mist. Its wooden walls were bleached and cracked, the windows clouded with dust and time. Inside, shelves held empty jars, faded maps, and a collection of notebooks. The notebooks contained meticulous observations about the forest, bird calls, weather patterns, tree growth, but on a few pages, faint sketches suggested careful monitoring of paths leading toward the lake. Lines and arrows traced trails, marking subtle deviations and hidden spots along the water's edge. Beyond the station, a narrow path wound along a creek, its waters bubbling softly over smooth stones. Fallen branches and moss obscured much of the trail, but occasional footprints appeared in the damp soil, too precise to be accidental. They led toward a cluster of cabins, some with sagging roofs, others with doors hanging loosely on their hinges. In front of one cabin, small piles of wood had been stacked neatly, though the surrounding grass was long and overgrown, suggesting the piles were no longer used for warmth or fire. He stepped inside one cabin cautiously. The air smelled faintly of damp pine and old smoke. On a table near the window, he found a small box of carefully folded notes. each listing times and places, paired with tiny sketches of paths through the forest. On the wall, faded photographs showed the lake from different angles, each one emphasizing the shoreline, docks, and reeds. Every image carried a quiet stillness, as if waiting for someone to notice the exact angles and positions. Leaving the cabins, he followed a faint trail that curved around a small hill. At the summit, the forest opened into a view of the lake, partially shrouded in mist. From this height, he noticed patterns in the shoreline he hadn't seen before: small inlets, overgrown docks, and the faint outline of another submerged structure near the western edge. It was difficult to discern, but the ripples in the water suggested something hidden beneath, and the reeds bent in unusual ways around it, almost as if shielding it from casual observation. Descending the hill, he entered a quieter section of the forest where the ground was soft with moss. Here, a narrow stream cut through the undergrowth, and along its banks he found a series of small, deliberate markers: a row of stones set upright, a small wooden stake with notches carved in it, and fragments of cloth tied to low branches. Each seemed to indicate a path, subtle guidance for someone moving quietly through the area. He followed the markers until they led to a forgotten dirt road. The road stretched straight for several hundred meters, lined with dense trees that blocked most of the light. Midway along the path, an old roadside shack appeared, its paint peeling, windows boarded, and roof sagging. Inside, he found journals with brief entries describing the lake at dawn, the docks, the submerged chest, and occasional trips to the cabins on the far side of the forest. Small sketches marked locations with careful precision, each detail understated but intentional. Continuing along the road, he noticed a small creek feeding into the lake, its water clear and shallow. Near the bank, flattened reeds suggested someone had recently passed through, and a faint trail of footprints led to a narrow, hidden dock. Unlike the main dock, this one was almost completely overgrown, the wood soft and damp, but it still offered a view of the lake and the distant submerged chest. He crouched to study the footprints. They were small, deliberate, and careful, showing a slow, methodical pace rather than haste. Beyond the dock, the path climbed again into a series of rolling hills, each covered in thin forest and scattered boulders. Among the rocks, he found the remnants of small cairns, arranged in patterns that suggested navigation, marking points of interest across the landscape. Nearby, a narrow hollow contained a cache of items: a small tin box, a bundle of rope, and a stack of folded papers with faded ink. The notes contained quiet observations of lake activity, forest trails, and cabin locations, written in short, measured lines. In the distance, he noticed another set of cabins, smaller and more isolated than the first. Their windows were shuttered, and the paths leading to them were obscured by brush. A narrow trail wound toward one cabin's back door, where footprints led to a small shed. Inside, he discovered fragments of maps showing docks, inlets, and trails, along with brief journal entries describing someone watching the lake, noting changes in the water, the fog, and the patterns of light across the reeds. He paused at a clearing where wildflowers had grown unchecked among stones and old tree stumps. The ground bore subtle depressions, perhaps from repeated visits or the placement of objects. Among the flowers, a small tin container had been partially buried, containing notes about trips across the lake, positions of submerged objects, and observations of the quiet patterns of movement in the forest. Each detail was understated, precise, and deliberate. Returning toward the village, he followed a narrow trail that ran along the eastern shoreline. Here, the forest opened to reveal small inlets and overgrown docks he hadn't seen from the main road. He paused to note the gentle sway of reeds in the water, the subtle shifts in the mist, and the quiet reflection of the forest along the lake's surface. Somewhere beneath, the submerged chest remained, its outlines softened by the water and overgrowth, a silent centerpiece of the network of clues he was tracing. Near the village edge, a small, deserted greenhouse caught his attention. Its glass panels were cracked, vines creeping inside, and the floor was damp. Within, he found pots with dried soil, small tools, and a collection of notebooks. The notebooks contained careful records of plant growth, weather patterns, and subtle sketches of trails leading to the lake and docks. Marginal notes suggested repeated observation of movement across the forest and shoreline. Along the northern road, he came across a tiny roadside cafe, long abandoned. Tables were overturned, menus faded, and the windows were clouded. Inside, scraps of paper lay scattered, names, dates, and faint references to the lake, the docks, and the surrounding forest. Each note was understated, almost casual, yet hinted at careful attention to details that might otherwise go unnoticed. A narrow trail near the cafe led into a dense grove of trees. Here, he noticed unusual markings on tree trunks, symbols carved lightly, some filled with moss, others barely visible. Beneath them, the ground bore subtle depressions, and small sticks and stones had been arranged in quiet patterns, suggesting deliberate observation and repeated visits. He paused at the edge of the grove, looking back toward the lake. The morning mist had begun to lift, revealing the dock and the water, still calm and reflective. The chest remained beneath the surface, unchanged and patient. Around it, reeds swayed gently. The wind whispered softly through the trees, and the subtle patterns of human presence continued to ripple quietly across the landscape. Walking further along the path, he discovered another hidden cabin, smaller and more isolated than the others. Its walls were partially collapsed, but inside, he found remnants of journals, folded papers, and a small wooden box containing notes on trips to the lake, observations of the docks, and subtle records of environmental patterns. Every entry was precise, deliberate, and understated, emphasizing patience and attention over action or haste. A short distance away, a narrow trail descended to a small inlet. Water trickled over stones, reeds swayed gently, and the soft murmur of insects filled the quiet air. Among the reeds, faint traces of footprints led to a makeshift platform of stones and wood, partially hidden beneath overgrowth. Here, the observations of someone long gone had been made with care, each detail considered in relation to the lake, the docks, and the surrounding forest. He lingered at the edge of the inlet, noting the way the sunlight filtered through the mist, casting muted reflections across the water. The chest remained calm beneath the surface, the reeds bending softly around it. Every subtle trace, from footprints to stones, from journals to carved symbols, contributed to a slow, deliberate rhythm of observation, patience, and quiet unfolding. Beyond the inlet, he followed a faint trail through the hills. Broken fences, scattered stones, and small clusters of leaves marked repeated passage. A shallow hollow contained remnants of rope and wood, arranged carefully, as if to signal a path or mark a location. Every subtle detail invited attention, requiring slow observation and quiet contemplation to perceive the network of presence woven across the forest, lake, and village. Near the western shore, He came upon an old boathouse, long and used, its roof sagging and walls moss-covered. Inside, fragments of journals, sketches of the lake, and notes on dock locations lay scattered. The entries were short and precise, noting subtle observations of water, fog, reeds, and the patterns of quiet movement through the forest. Each detail added to the unfolding tapestry of deliberate, patient observation that stretched across the landscape. He paused along a narrow trail leading to the ridge above the lake. The view revealed the network of docks, cabins, inlets, and forest trails in a muted, gray expanse. The mist hovered low over the water, softening the contours of the chest below the main dock. Reeds swayed gently, reflecting the subtle rhythm that had persisted across the village, forest, and hills. A faint side trail led him to another abandoned structure, a small watchtower, its wood dark with age and dampness. From its elevated perch, he could see the lake, the docks, the forest paths, and hidden clearings. Inside, remnants of notebooks, tools, and small markers suggested careful observation of the environment, each detail recorded with calm attention, patience, and quiet intent. Walking back toward the village along the southern path, he noticed a series of subtle markers, small piles of stones, broken branches arranged deliberately, and faint tracks in soft soil. Each indicated repeated passage and careful attention to the surroundings. The rhythm of movement, observation, and quiet discovery continued steadily, layering subtle traces over the landscape. At the edge of a small forest glade, he discovered fragments of an old ledger, damp but legible. Notes detailed trips to the lake, observations of the docks, and precise records of forest trails. Sketches illustrated hidden pathways and subtle markers, suggesting someone had moved deliberately across the area for years, observing and recording without hurry or urgency. He paused near the main dock as the evening mist settled across the water. The chest remained beneath the surface, still and patient. Reeds swayed softly, lanterns reflected dimly on the water, and the surrounding forest hummed gently. Every footprint, journal entry, carved symbol, and stone marker contributed to a slow, deliberate rhythm of investigation and quiet discovery, inviting continued attention, careful observation, and patient understanding. Along a faint trail leading east from the dock, he came across a small, overgrown orchard. Trees bore twisted branches, the ground soft with fallen leaves, and hidden among them were traces of human presence, shallow depressions, arranged stones, and small scraps of paper. Each detail was quiet, subtle, and deliberate, forming another piece of the intricate puzzle spread across the lake, forest, and village. He moved on toward a narrow creek cutting through the southern hills. The water gurgled softly over smooth stones, reeds bent gently along the banks, and occasional footprints suggested careful passage. Small wooden stakes and stone markers indicated intentional observation of paths, the lake, and subtle environmental patterns, all quietly recorded through repeated, patient attention. A short distance along the creek, an abandoned cabin appeared almost hidden by brush. Inside, scattered papers, faded sketches, and small bundles of rope suggested meticulous attention to movement through the forest and along the shoreline. Each entry noted subtle changes in water, fog, and forest conditions, echoing the slow, deliberate rhythm of observation that had persisted across the landscape. The lake remained calm beneath the thickening mist. The submerged chest held its quiet place, reeds bending softly around it. Every trace, Footprints, journals, carvings, stone markers, and scattered remnants of human presence contributed to the unfolding pattern of patience, careful observation, and quiet discovery that stretched from the village through the forest and across the hills. He returned once more to the main dock, the mist hovering just above the water like a slow, gray veil. Standing quietly at the edge, he let his gaze drift over the reeds, the subtle ripples, and the distant outlines of cabins and hills. It struck him, slowly, that every trace he had found, the journals, the footprints, the markers in the forest, the scattered notes, the sketches, the subtle signs in the abandoned cabins, was connected by one deliberate intention: careful observation of the lake and its rhythms. He thought of the submerged chest. It had been there for decades, untouched, quietly central to the network of careful movements, measurements, and notes. The chest wasn't the focal point of secrecy or danger. It was a marker, a constant reference in a slow, methodical practice. Whoever had placed it had done so with patience, knowing it would remain still, a quiet anchor for everything else around it. Walking along the northern ridge, he traced the familiar paths again, noticing the subtle alignment of stones and sticks that had guided him before. They weren't random. They were a quiet system, a way for someone to navigate the forest, observe the lake, and record information over time. Every small clearing, every arrangement of rocks, every carved symbol now seemed like pieces of a meticulous, ongoing study rather than signs of alarm or immediate threat. He paused in one clearing, sunlight filtering gently through the trees. A realization settled slowly. The lake itself had been the center of attention all along. Its tides, fog, reflections, and hidden inlets had been monitored, marked, and recorded with patient care. The human traces scattered throughout the forest, the footprints, journals, small markers, were evidence of someone moving deliberately to understand the rhythms of this quiet world, to map its stillness and its hidden edges. Visiting the abandoned cabins once again, he leafed through the journals with renewed focus. The notes described trips at dawn, the subtle shifts in water and wind, the exact positions of reeds, the condition of the docks, and occasional references to the chest beneath the water. Nothing spoke of hurry, conflict, or panic. Everything spoke of attention, reflection, and patience. Over time, a picture began to form. Someone had dedicated years to quietly observing, recording, and understanding the lake and its surroundings. Returning to the village, he spoke with the elderly baker. She remembered someone who had spent long hours by the water, often at first light or in the gentle evening fog, quietly noting the environment, leaving small markers in the reeds, arranging stones along the paths. There was no sense of secrecy in a sinister way. Rather, it was ritualistic, careful, and deliberate. It was someone who sought to know the lake fully, to understand it in ways most people never would. He wandered through the overgrown orchard near the southern hills, noticing the faint markers he had seen before: stones, small stakes, subtle arrangements of sticks. Now, their purpose became clearer. Each had been placed to guide the movements of someone across the land, to measure and record, to make note of positions in relation to the lake and the forests. Nothing had been left to chance. Every detail reflected careful, methodical thought, a long-term study of the quiet world. Returning to the creek where he had found the small wooden stakes and stone markers, he finally understood their role. They were not warnings, not signs of danger. They were guides, a system of notation in the landscape itself. Footprints led to points of observation, to vantage spots from which the lake could be surveyed, to clearings from which the movement of reeds, fog, and water could be recorded. The forest, the hills, the docks, and even the submerged chest formed a living grid, quietly observed over years. He lingered at the edge of the inlet, where the water moved softly over stones. The chest, once a source of uncertainty, now felt like a center of quiet reflection. It had been left not for concealment, but as a fixed point for careful study. The reeds, the docks, the shoreline, the forest trails, they were all part of a deliberate, patient system. Slowly, he saw that the mystery was not one of malice or sudden disappearance, but one of dedication, of a quiet human intent to understand a place intimately. Walking along the narrow trail toward the hidden cabins, he felt the patterns of the forest align with the observations he had made over weeks. Footprints, stone markers, carved symbols, journal entries, they all pointed to the same slow truth. Someone had lived among this landscape in careful attention, moving deliberately, observing patiently, leaving notes and markers to guide themselves and perhaps future visitors. Even the abandoned structures, ranger station, watchtower, boathouses, and cabins, made sense now as stations of quiet monitoring. From each vantage, the lake could be observed, movements recorded, and subtle changes in fog, water, and light documented. The forest itself had become an extended notebook, each trail, stone, and hollow a line of recorded information, subtle but precise. In the chapel, he noticed once again the faint impressions of hands and knees, the gentle sway of the bell rope. These were quiet signs of someone marking ritual and reflection, aligning observation with mindfulness. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't hurried. It was the measured rhythm of presence over time. Every detail in the environment now spoke of patience, study, and deliberate awareness. He returned to the dock as the sun settled low over the misty lake. The water shimmered softly, reeds bending gently with the wind. The chest lay beneath the surface, still, quiet, patient. In the patterns of the footprints, the journals, the markers, the sketches, and the abandoned structures, the mystery had resolved itself into something gentle and reflective, a human effort to know, to map, to watch quietly, over years, a landscape both beautiful and elusive. He walked slowly along the shoreline, tracing paths he had seen marked by sticks and stones. He understood the rhythm now. The lake was studied, the forest observed, the markers placed as reminders, guides, and reflections. There was no final act, no dramatic reveal, only the soft unfolding of human patience, of careful attention, and the quiet reverence for the still world that had inspired it. At the far end of the northern trail, where the forest opened into hills and the morning mist had begun to lift, he paused to absorb the scene. Every path, dock, cabin, and creek, every stone and footprint, connected in a subtle, deliberate way. The person who had made all these observations had left not chaos, but a map of quiet life, a rhythm of patience, and a record of steady reflection over decades. He lingered there, listening to the soft murmur of the water, the gentle rustle of reeds, the distant hum of insects. In that quiet, the story became clear, not a story of fear or loss, but one of careful presence, of human observation harmonized with the natural rhythms of the lake, the forest, and the hills. Each clue, each trace, each marker was a testament to time, patience, and mindful attention. Along the southern ridge, he found a small grove he had not yet explored. Stones and sticks were arranged in gentle patterns. Journals lay partially buried beneath leaves, and faint footprints led in slow, deliberate loops. Here, at last, the web of observation felt complete. Everything pointed to the same truth. The lake and forest had been studied with quiet devotion, every detail recorded and noted, forming a tapestry of subtle understanding rather than suspense or drama. At the dock, he paused once more. The water reflected the soft evening sky, the reeds whispered in the gentle wind, and the chest remained in its place beneath the surface. The forest, trails, cabins, and markers all seemed to settle into calm coherence. Slowly, he understood. The mystery had never been about disappearance or threat, but about care, patience, and the quiet human desire to know and honor a hidden world. He walked along the shoreline, taking in the stillness, the patterns of the landscape, and the delicate, measured traces left over years. Every observation connected, every subtle clue aligned, and a gentle, reflective calm settled over him. The investigation, once filled with uncertainty, had become a quiet meditation on attention, patience, and the slow unfolding of time. At the far eastern trail, where the forest thinned and the hills met the lake, he noticed the faint remains of another marker, a small wooden stake, weathered, yet carefully positioned. It, too, fit into the larger pattern, another note in the quiet record of observation. The lake shimmered, the forest breathed, and the rhythm of all the subtle traces, the footprints, journals, sketches, and structures, resolved into a slow, reflective understanding of deliberate, patient presence. Along the northern shore, he paused beneath a cluster of alder trees. Faint impressions in the mud, the careful arrangement of stones, and remnants of journals confirmed the same truth. Someone had spent years moving quietly, observing carefully, and recording methodically. The chest beneath the main dock, the abandoned cabins, the forest trails, the docks along hidden inlets, all formed part of a coherent, gentle map of attention, study, and mindful care. Walking back toward the village, he absorbed the quiet rhythm that had guided all the traces. Footprints, journals, sketches, markers, and subtle environmental changes were now understood not as mystery, but as a patient, reflective pattern spanning years. The lake, forest, and village had been observed with care, and in that observation, a quiet truth emerged. A story of human presence harmonized with the calm, steady rhythm of the natural world. At the main dock, he lingered until dusk. The mist drifted slowly over the water, reeds whispered softly, and the chest rested beneath the surface. Everywhere around him, the traces of careful observation, the paths, cabins, journals, stones, and small markers, came together into a calm, reflective understanding. The mystery had unfolded not through revelation or action, but through patient noticing, gentle tracing, and quiet attention to the rhythms of a place that had been studied with dedication over decades. Case 3. A thin veil of fog lingered over the pier that morning, softening the edges of the water and blurring the distant hills into muted shapes. A solitary rowboat floated tied to a weathered post, rocking gently, though no one had come to untie it. The ropes were damp with dew, and for a moment, it seemed as though the boat had arrived on its own, drifting silently from somewhere unknown. Along the narrow gravel road that led down from the ridge, the tires of a patrol car crunched slowly. The officer moved with quiet deliberation, noting the faint tracks pressed into the soil, footprints that seemed to pause, almost hesitate, before vanishing entirely into the tall grass. There were no voices, only the distant call of a gull and a faint splash where the water met the old dock. The small coastal town nearby had not seen visitors in days. Windows of shuttered homes reflected the gray light, the shutters themselves rattling softly in a breeze that barely existed. In the local cafe, an elderly woman sipped her tea alone, eyes tracing the path of the morning mist across the harbor. She remembered the rumors of a man who sometimes walked the edge of the cliffs at dawn, though no one had seen him for weeks. Further along the path, past the fishing shacks and empty sheds, a bicycle lay half hidden in the reeds. Its frame was coated in a thin layer of frost, the handlebars tilted as if the rider had simply stepped away for a moment. The chain clicked faintly when nudged, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the quiet lapping of water against old pilings. Investigators arrived slowly, carrying notebooks and cameras, their steps careful on the uneven planks of the pier. They did not speak loudly. Words were whispered, notes written in soft cursive. One paused to examine the boat, noting a subtle scrape along the hull, a mark that could have been caused by an anchor or by something larger brushing the wood in the dark. From the ridge, the forested hills rolled in gentle waves, the pines standing in clusters, dark and serene. A trail wound down to the edge of a small inlet where reeds bowed under the weight of moisture. Along the banks, tiny footprints, too small to belong to a man, too deliberate to be random, marred the soft mud. They circled the inlet once, then disappeared into the water as though swallowed by the morning. An abandoned cabin perched at the edge of the woods, its windows opaque with years of dust. Inside, the air was heavy and still. On a rickety shelf, old jars of preserved food rested undisturbed, their labels faded. A journal lay open on the table, pages yellowed and brittle, filled with a meticulous script recounting daily routines that seemed ordinary at first glance, until lines began to hint at someone being watched, or perhaps following someone quietly through the woods. The local librarian was asked to check old records, and she moved slowly among the stacks, her fingers tracing the spines of books that smelled of smoke and pine. She found mentions of a fisherman who vanished decades ago, and a diary entry noting a strange bell sound that echoed over the water on certain mornings. Nothing in the accounts was loud or alarming. The details were understated, almost gentle. Yet, they painted a pattern that stretched across years and generations. By the riverbank, mist curled around the gnarled roots of trees that leaned over the water, their reflections blurred in the gentle current. A single shoe, worn and delicate, rested on a root, half submerged. No other belonged nearby. Investigators noted it quietly, photographing it from several angles, before moving on to follow the faint path that led into the forest. Along the trail, the sound of leaves shifting occasionally marked some presence. Perhaps an animal, perhaps not. Small clearings revealed remnants of old campsites, fire pits cold and ashen. On one flat stone, a ring of tiny stones had been carefully arranged, almost like a map, though the meaning was unclear. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and pine sap, grounding the senses in a quiet reality, even as curiosity whispered about hidden events. In the distance, a low hill hid a small network of abandoned cottages, each with its own story, each window staring blankly. One had a door slightly ajar, and inside, the floorboards creaked under the lightest step. Dust motes floated in shafts of soft morning sun, revealing footprints that seemed to lead nowhere. A stack of newspapers in the corner bore headlines of missing persons and weather warnings, each folded to hide a section, as though intentionally overlooked. The fog thickened near the old lighthouse, the tower's silhouette barely visible, ghostly against the gray sky. Its interior staircase spiraled upward, steps worn and polished by years of solitary climbs. A notebook rested on the top platform, pages open to sketches of boats, tide charts, and shapes that seemed familiar yet indistinct. A faint, salty smell clung to the paper, hinting at long nights spent watching, recording, waiting. A small bridge further upstream arched over water that murmured against smooth stones. Beneath it, a collection of small, carefully arranged items, shells, feathers, glass fragments, rested in the shallows. They were not left by children, the investigators thought, but by someone deliberate, taking time to place each object with care. Nearby, a journal entry discovered later in a cabin noted footsteps that moved like whispers along the bridge at dawn, though no one could confirm if they were real or imagined. The forest deepened as the trail wound away from water, the undergrowth soft and thick. Occasionally, a sound, a branch snapping, a faint scrape of bark, would prompt a pause, a quiet inspection, yet nothing revealed itself. One old tree bore carvings in a language long forgotten, letters that seemed random, yet repeated in patterns. Investigators photographed each marking, noting them carefully, the rhythm of the work slow and methodical. Along a desolate country lane, the air was heavy with late morning mist. Wildflowers leaned along the fence posts, dripping with condensation. An overturned mailbox revealed letters scattered along the ground, unopened for months. One bore a postmark from years ago, the address now belonging to a house empty for decades. Its contents were mundane, bills, reminders, and yet, tucked at the bottom, a note in delicate handwriting that simply read, "They watch the water at dawn." At the edge of a marsh, reeds whispered as a faint wind drifted across the water. A small wooden rowboat had been tied to a post here as well, empty except for a single oar resting neatly across its center. The oar bore scratches, not deep, but precise, like something had been dragged along it repeatedly. The investigators traced its edge with gloved hands, noting the smoothness and faint salt residue. They recorded it quietly, moving on along the marsh's narrow path. A distant hill overlooked the marsh, crowned with an old signal tower long out of use. Its rusted frame creaked softly when the wind shifted, a low, moaning sound carried across the water. At the base, a notebook was wedged between stones, pages partially wet, containing a sequence of observations. Tides, moon phases, faint sketches of figures on the shore. Nothing alarming, nothing hurried, simply recorded, as though the watcher had taken careful notes over many mornings. The winding road returned to the town, where a small antique shop displayed glass jars of buttons, tarnished silverware, and old maps folded carefully in drawers. Among the maps, a section of coastline was marked repeatedly with tiny excess, each precise, almost obsessive. A clerk recalled a man who visited often, moving silently among the shelves, always looking but never buying. His presence left a trace in memory, gentle, quiet, but distinct in its irregularity. Nearby, a narrow creek wound through an abandoned orchard. Apples, bruised and half-rotted, lay scattered across the wet earth. A small wooden crate rested near the bank, filled with items too ordinary to alarm. A spool of thread, a fragment of rope, a pair of gloves. Yet the crate had been positioned deliberately, the corners pressed flat against the mud, suggesting intention, careful and patient. At the top of a small ridge, the investigators paused near a cluster of rocks where lichen grew thick and soft. A single shoe print pressed into the soil, wet and recent, though the surrounding area bore no signs of travel. They noted its size, the direction it faced, the faint indentations left by heel and toe. A bird called softly in the distance, and for a moment, everything felt still, suspended in quiet observation. A narrow wooden path led into the deeper forest, elevated slightly above marshland. Along its edges, tiny mushrooms grew in precise clusters, and fallen leaves were pushed aside in patterns, almost like someone had traced a path. At the end of the path, a clearing revealed a small stone circle, moss-covered and forgotten. Within it, a journal lay, open to pages filled with faint sketches of the coastline, tides, and faintly, footprints along the shore. The distant sound of the sea drifted over the hills, steady and calming. Along the waterline, driftwood collected in soft piles, each piece worn smooth, some arranged as if someone had paused to consider them. A single shoe rested atop one pile, its sole worn, and nearby, a thin rope trailed into the shallows. No one was present, and the world felt suspended in this quiet, careful observation, as though the mysteries themselves waited for attention, patiently, without urgency. The old forest road continued, winding past thickets of pine and birch, its surface mottled with shadows of shifting clouds. At intervals, faint marks on the ground suggested pauses, moments of rest or consideration, though no footprints connected them. Among the undergrowth, small bundles of moss held tiny items, a fragment of glass, a feather, a smooth stone. Each was carefully chosen and placed, though their purpose remained unknown. A small, unused dock jutted into a tranquil bay, the water reflecting the gray light softly. Wooden planks were worn and uneven, and the rope used to tie a single canoe coiled neatly at the edge. Beneath it, shadows moved gently in the water, though no current stirred. Investigators paused, looking into the depths, noting the faint patterns of reflected clouds, the subtle movement of algae, and the slow rhythm of waves brushing the shore. In the orchard, the wind shifted again, rustling leaves, revealing a hidden doorway at the base of an old, hollowed tree. Its frame was delicate, crafted from branches, barely noticeable. Inside, tiny objects rested on shelves, carved pebbles, a fragment of a notebook, a ribbon frayed with age. Each seemed to have been placed carefully, deliberately, as though someone had been preserving small moments, invisible to most, but observed with care. The road climbed higher, winding toward a ridge overlooking both forest and water. A small cabin stood there, its windows reflecting soft light, the door slightly ajar. Inside, dust motes floated in the air, and on the table, a stack of papers recorded observations of tides, weather, and small figures glimpsed along the shore. There was no rush in the entries, only the slow, deliberate note of a presence quietly watching, waiting, and recording the subtle rhythms of the world around them. Along the ridge, a narrow path led to a cliff edge where fog hugged the water below. Rocks were arranged in small patterns, some forming shapes, others simply marking spots along the edge. A faint trail of footprints led away from the cliff, back into the forest, but nothing else disturbed the stillness. The investigators moved quietly, noting each detail with care, letting the slow unfolding of the mystery guide their steps. A rowboat rested in the shallows of a hidden cove, its hull scratched lightly, water pooling inside. Near it, reeds bent under the weight of morning dew. A notebook was tucked beneath the seat, pages open to sketches of the surrounding coastline, small arrows pointing to places along the shore. No words were written, only the calm, meticulous observation of someone who had been here many mornings before, quietly tracing the world in careful detail. At the edge of the forest, a series of stone markers led up a small hill, each one inscribed with faint symbols worn smooth by time. Between the stones, tiny paths of flattened grass suggested deliberate passage. Near the top, a small clearing opened to reveal a wooden bench facing the water. On it rested a single pair of gloves, neatly folded, and beside them, a thin notebook filled with observations that spanned months, possibly years. A faint wind carried the scent of salt and pine, moving across the empty fields beyond the forest. The investigators paused, letting the quiet settle around them, noting the slow, deliberate patterns of footprints, objects, and sketches left behind. Each detail was small, understated, yet together they suggested a presence both patient and deliberate. The sun rose higher, filtering through the fog, and across the marshes, docks, cliffs, and hills, a slow rhythm persisted. Boats remained tied to empty piers, paths wound quietly through the forest, and tiny objects rested carefully in hidden places. Each clue, each observation, unfolded gently, like whispers of a story still being written, patiently, in the calm expanse of this remote and quiet world. And somewhere, beyond the hills and fog, footprints continued to appear, small and deliberate, leaving only the quiet trace of presence in the world. The trail led the investigators toward a narrow dirt road, flanked by overgrown hedges and a line of telephone poles stretching into the mist. The wires hummed faintly in the morning air, carrying no sound but vibrating ever so slightly, like a heartbeat beneath the fog. Alongside the road, an abandoned gas station sat quietly, its pumps rusted and paint flaking, the canopy sagging with years of neglect. Inside the gas station, shelves sagged under the weight of dusty cans and boxes, labels faded almost to illegibility. A small notepad rested behind the counter, half hidden beneath a layer of dirt. On its pages, someone had written numbers and times, neat and deliberate, followed by short sketches of roads and waterways. The handwriting was careful, precise, yet the meaning remained elusive. Beyond the station, a narrow wooden bridge arched over a shallow creek. Its boards were worn, slightly bowed, and a faint stain ran along one plank. Investigators knelt to examine it, noticing small impressions, perhaps from boots or small tools, pressed into the wood. The water below rippled quietly, reflecting the fog in soft gray patterns. A few miles down the road, a small lake appeared, tucked among dense pines. The water was still, smooth as glass, with reeds bowing gently along the edges. A single dock extended into the lake, crooked and uneven, yet stable. Tied to it was a rowboat, weathered and quiet, its oar resting across the seats. On the far shore, faint tracks led into the trees, the soil pressed flat and glistening faintly with moisture. Nearby, a ranger station had been left locked and empty, its windows dark but the building intact. A soft note was tucked beneath the door, folded carefully. It bore a sketch of the surrounding forest and a few cryptic numbers, perhaps coordinates or dates. The station smelled faintly of pine polish and old paper, the kind of scent that lingered long after the room had been abandoned. Along the forest edge, investigators discovered a small wooden shack, barely visible among the trees. Its door creaked softly as it swung on rusted hinges. Inside, a lantern rested on a shelf, unlit but covered in a thin layer of dust. A stack of papers lay beside it, detailing weather patterns and tidal observations, alongside small, precise sketches of paths through the forest. The handwriting was the same as in the notepad at the gas station, deliberate and unhurried. Beyond the shack, a gravel path wound into denser woods. Occasional clearings revealed stone foundations, remnants of cottages long since decayed. Moss and vines had claimed the structures, yet each retained a sense of careful placement. Among the rubble, investigators found tiny piles of objects, pebbles arranged in arcs, twigs aligned like arrows, and a single button pressed into the soil. Each seemed intentional, carefully left as though to mark a passage or point of observation. A quiet road emerged from the forest, lined with small homes. Few had lights or signs of life. A bakery with shuttered windows held faint aromas of bread, lingering from an earlier morning. The baker, an older man, recalled seeing a figure walking slowly along the road at dawn, pausing at windows and doors, always moving quietly, never disturbing anything. His voice was low, calm, recounting details without urgency. Near the lake's far end, a series of small docks extended into the water. Each bore signs of recent use. Boards worn smooth in patterns suggesting deliberate movement, ropes tied and untied repeatedly. A fishing net had been folded neatly on one dock, and beneath it, faint footprints pressed into the mud. They were small and irregular, as though someone had moved deliberately, stopping often to observe. A trail from the docks led into a thicket where birch trees leaned over a small stream. Among the roots, a tin box lay partially buried. Investigators pried it open slowly, revealing fragments of maps, carefully folded, and a compass resting atop them. The items were clean and orderly, untouched by the surrounding decay. Each page bore annotations in the same precise handwriting, marking locations along the coast and forest edges. Along a hillside overlooking the lake, a series of benches had been placed at intervals, facing the water. On one bench rested a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were tiny stones, a feather, and a fragment of cloth with faint embroidery. It seemed deliberately left, arranged with care, as though meant to be found but not disturbed. The air here was cool, carrying a faint scent of wet earth and pine sap. The path continued toward an old sawmill, its walls weathered, the roof sagging in places. Inside, beams creaked softly underfoot, and dust motes floated in the dim light filtering through broken windows. On a work table, tools were arranged neatly, saws, hammers, and chisels aligned in order. A small notebook rested open, its pages filled with diagrams of paths, water currents, and faint markings resembling footprints. A quiet dirt lane led from the sawmill to a small cluster of cabins, each set apart from the others by trees and low fences. One cabin had a window slightly cracked open. Inside, a single chair faced a table with papers scattered across it. Sketches of boats, docks, and small islands filled the pages, interspersed with notes of times, tides, and weather observations. Each mark was calm, deliberate, methodical, as if documenting a slow, patient rhythm. A narrow trail diverged from the cabins, winding into a dense pine forest. Fallen logs created small bridges over streams, and the investigators moved with careful steps, listening to the faint rustle of leaves. Along the trail, small cairns of stones appeared at irregular intervals, some topped with feathers or tiny scraps of cloth. They were simple, understated, but clearly arranged with intention. A rickety wooden footbridge spanned a creek further along. Its boards groaned faintly, the nails rusty but holding firm. On one side, a bundle of reeds had been tied together and left leaning against a post. A journal had been tucked into the reeds, its pages detailing observations of moonlight on the water, patterns of birds, and the occasional presence of distant figures moving along the shoreline. The path continued past a small pond, the surface smooth and reflective, bordered by cattails. A canoe rested at the edge, tied loosely with a frayed rope. Inside, a folded piece of cloth contained a small collection of shells and stones, each arranged deliberately. Nearby, faint tracks led from the pond into the forest, but no other signs of movement were present. At the top of a gentle hill, an abandoned ranger lookout tower stood, its ladder slightly warped with age. Climbing carefully, investigators reached the platform, noting the expansive view of forest, lake, and distant hills. A notebook lay open on the railing, pages filled with precise sketches of paths, waterways, and small structures. Notes were minimal, quiet observations recorded over time, each marked deliberate, patient, and calm. A dirt path branched off from the tower, leading to a small creek crossing. Wooden stepping stones spanned the water, worn smooth. Near the creek bank, a shallow depression held a small cluster of objects: a button, a piece of cloth, and a smooth pebble. All were clean, carefully arranged, suggesting someone had paused here and taken care to leave them in place. Further down the road, a narrow dock extended into a secluded bay. Tied to it was a small, weathered rowboat. Inside, faint scratches lined the interior, subtle and precise, as though something had been moved along the wood repeatedly. Nearby reeds bent gently under the morning breeze, hiding small objects tucked among the stalks: stones, feathers, scraps of fabric. A cabin nestled on the hillside overlooked the bay. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and old paper. A desk held scattered papers, sketches of boats and shoreline, with small annotations of time and tide. The handwriting was careful and calm, noting small movements along the water, shapes seen in the mist, without urgency or alarm. The forest thinned along the next ridge, revealing an old orchard. Trees were heavy with overripe fruit, the ground damp. Beneath a gnarled apple tree, a small wooden crate held a collection of stones, feathers, and shells, each positioned carefully. Investigators paused, noting the rhythm of placement, the quiet deliberation, and the patience of someone who had moved here slowly over many mornings. A narrow trail wound further into the hills, passing clusters of wildflowers and patches of moss. Along the edges, tiny markers had been placed: carved sticks, carefully aligned rocks, and scraps of fabric. Each seemed to mark a path, a rhythm, a movement through the quiet, secluded landscape. A small ranger station sat at the top of the hill, its windows dark, a single chair visible inside. On a counter, a notebook lay open, filled with faint sketches of the surrounding hills and forests, with small notes on the movement of shadows and the reflection of water. Each line was calm, deliberate, a slow observation of the world. The fog drifted back over the hills, softening shapes and muting sound. Along the roads, trails, and water, small objects rested, footprints appeared and disappeared, and quiet notes and sketches suggested a presence always observing, always patient. The investigators moved slowly, noting each subtle mark, each delicate arrangement, allowing the quiet rhythm of discovery to guide them deeper into the mystery. A narrow dirt track wound down the hillside, bordered by low stone walls covered in moss and ivy. Along the path, the investigators noticed faint impressions in the soil, small depressions that hinted at recent passage, though no footprints were fully clear. The air carried the scent of damp earth, pine, and something faintly metallic, lingering but elusive. At the base of the hill, a long-abandoned textile mill stood, its brick walls streaked with moss and lichen. Windows were broken or opaque with grime, the interior shadows deep and still. Inside, rusted machinery sat in quiet rows, belts and gears frozen in time. A small ledge held scraps of paper, some folded into triangles, marked with symbols that seemed deliberate, placed with care. Through a side entrance, a narrow corridor led to an office where a desk still held ledgers, their pages yellowed and fragile. Scribbled notes traced the flow of the river nearby, times and measurements recorded in small, neat handwriting. A faint pattern emerged across pages, small intervals of observation, brief notations of movement along the riverbank, subtle and calm. Beyond the mill, a gravel road curved gently through open fields, bordered by clusters of wildflowers and patches of damp grass. A lone farmhouse appeared, distant and quiet, smoke curling faintly from a chimney. The farmer, a soft-spoken man, recalled seeing a figure walking along the ridge at dusk, pausing at intervals as though listening or watching something unseen. His recollection was slow and deliberate, words chosen carefully, without alarm. A narrow footpath led from the farmhouse to a small pond tucked among willows. The water was glassy, reflecting the gray light and thin clouds above. At the edge, a row of stones formed a small arc, each stone smoothed by time and positioned with care. Tiny fragments of fabric lay among the stones, almost imperceptible, yet arranged in quiet, deliberate patterns. A wooden bridge further along spanned a shallow stream. The boards creaked softly under careful steps, the water below murmur over smooth stones. Beneath the bridge, small objects were hidden among reeds, a feather, a piece of thread, a shard of pottery. Each object was placed gently, as though marking a path, a sequence, or perhaps recording a quiet observation over time. Through the trees, the investigators discovered a small ranger cabin tucked against a hillside. The windows were fogged with condensation, and the door swung slightly when touched. Inside, a simple cot rested against the wall, and a desk held stacks of paper, each sheet carefully filled with diagrams of local trails, forest clearings, and the subtle movement of wildlife. A faint notation marked a recent observation near the creek, recorded with patience and precision. A narrow trail led out of the forest to a field scattered with boulders. Among them, small piles of pebbles had been arranged in arcs, some forming tiny concentric circles. The investigators traced the pattern slowly, noting subtle shifts in alignment, as though the arrangement had been updated over time. A notebook left beneath a large stone contained observations of birds and the shifting light across the fields. A quiet road curved along the edge of a cliff, overlooking a bay where fog hovered over the water. A small dock jutted into the shallow waves, its planks dark with moisture. Tied to the dock was a canoe, the interior smooth and worn in parallel lines, faint scratches lining the seats. Nearby reeds bent under the faint breeze, concealing a small bundle of objects, shells, feathers, and stones arranged in a subtle, deliberate sequence. Beyond the bay, a forgotten trail wound through dense pine and birch. Along its edges, small markers had been placed: carved sticks, tiny piles of stones, and pieces of frayed cloth. Each seemed to signal careful observation, quiet notation of the landscape. Investigators paused often, listening to the soft wind rustling leaves, the distant murmur of water, the faint creak of branches. A small abandoned church appeared at the edge of the trail, its steeple leaning slightly, windows fogged and opaque. Inside, pews were coated in dust, and the floorboards creaked under each careful step. On the altar, a stack of papers held sketches of the surrounding landscape: forests, lakes, and paths marked with subtle symbols. The writing was neat, slow, and deliberate, a record of quiet observation rather than urgency. A thin path led from the church into an orchard where old apple trees bent under the weight of ripening fruit. Beneath one gnarled tree, a wooden crate rested half buried in moss. Inside, small stones, feathers, and fragments of cloth were arranged carefully, each piece positioned with intention. A notebook lay nearby, filled with calm, precise notes about tides, wind, and the movement of shadows across the orchard floor. A narrow road ran along the edge of a shallow river, bordered by reeds and clusters of wildflowers. Faint footprints pressed into the soft mud, small and irregular, moving in gentle arcs. Investigators noted them quietly, following the path to a small row of abandoned cabins hidden among trees. Each cabin held objects carefully arranged: stones, sticks, feathers, and scraps of paper with faint sketches of the surrounding area. Through the forest, a faint trail led to a hidden pond, its water still and reflective. Along the shore, small piles of driftwood had been stacked in careful patterns. A canoe rested half submerged at the edge, with a thin rope coiled neatly across the seats. Nearby, tiny scraps of fabric and stones had been positioned with care, subtle markers of presence, deliberate but understated. A rickety footbridge crossed a stream further along the path. Beneath it, small objects rested in the water: smooth pebbles, a feather, and a fragment of cloth. Investigators paused to photograph each carefully, noting the precise placement, the quiet attention to detail. The water flowed gently, carrying a faint reflection of the fog and trees above, creating a sense of calm that matched the deliberate rhythm of the observations. A small abandoned workshop appeared at the edge of a clearing, its door ajar and sagging. Inside, shelves were lined with tools arranged neatly, and a desk held papers with faint sketches of trails, streams, and objects left along the way. Notes recorded times and observations, careful and methodical, each entry calm, deliberate, and quiet. A trail continued along the ridge to a lookout point where a single wooden bench faced the water. On it rested a small bundle wrapped in cloth, containing stones, feathers, and a few scraps of paper. Each object was positioned deliberately, quietly, with intention. The investigators moved slowly, allowing the rhythm of observation and discovery to guide them deeper into the quiet, unfolding mystery. Further along, a gravel road led past a line of old cottages, their windows shuttered and doors closed. A faint aroma of wood smoke lingered in the air, though none of the chimneys were active. Inside one cottage, a table held papers filled with sketches of paths, waterways, and faint patterns of footprints. Everything was recorded with calm precision, a slow tracing of the subtle movements that had occurred across the landscape. A narrow path led through a grove of tall pines to a small, forgotten dock on the edge of a lake. A rowboat rested quietly in the shallow water, its oars aligned carefully across the seats. Near the dock, tiny objects had been placed among reeds, stones, feathers, and scraps of cloth, arranged deliberately and quietly. Investigators traced each object slowly, noting the subtle rhythm of presence that lingered in the landscape. A trail led from the dock into dense undergrowth, emerging near a small abandoned ranger station. Inside, a desk held journals with careful notes of tides, moon phases, and the movement of figures along the shore. Each entry was calm, deliberate, and patient, chronicling observations over time with no urgency, no alarm, only the slow unfolding of attention. The forest stretched ahead, shadowed and still, with narrow paths winding through trees and over streams. Small cairns, sticks, and carefully placed stones marked subtle patterns along the way. Investigators moved slowly, pausing to note each detail, each deliberate placement, as the quiet rhythm of the landscape continued, patient, deliberate, and waiting to be understood. A faint trail led the investigators to the edge of a willow-lined creek, the water moving softly over smooth stones. A small wooden footbridge arched across it, its planks warped slightly from years of rain. Beneath the bridge, a handful of objects rested, a single feather, a smooth pebble, and a tiny scrap of cloth, arranged carefully in the shallow water. The path continued into a quiet glade, where wildflowers leaned under the morning dew. At the center, a fallen tree created a natural bench. On it, someone had placed a bundle of small stones in a deliberate pattern, each one polished and positioned with intention. Investigators paused, noting the rhythm of placement, the quiet attention in each detail. A gravel road wound gently upward, flanked by fields of tall grass. At the top of the rise, a small wooden cabin rested against a copse of pines. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, shelves held jars of preserved food, each labeled neatly with dates. A journal lay open on a table, filled with observations of the forest, the movement of water, and the subtle patterns of shadows at different hours of the day. Beyond the cabin, a narrow path descended toward a hidden lake. The water was still and dark, mirroring the sky and surrounding trees. Along the shoreline, a series of flat stones formed a quiet path into the reeds. Tiny fragments of cloth and feathers were tucked among the stones, each placed as if to mark a precise position or direction. A small ranger station appeared further along the forest edge, its windows fogged but intact. Inside, a desk held a stack of papers detailing weather, tides, and the quiet movement of figures through the surrounding woods. Each entry was methodical, calm, deliberate, recording small moments that might otherwise go unnoticed. The investigators followed a narrow dirt road leading to a cluster of abandoned cottages. The paint had peeled from the walls, and windows were boarded or cracked. Inside one cottage, a stack of papers lay on a windowsill, each sheet containing sketches of paths through the woods, markings of stones, and subtle annotations on tides and light patterns. A small bundle of feathers rested atop the papers, positioned carefully. A trail from the cottages led into a dense pine forest, where the ground was soft with fallen needles. Small wooden markers appeared at intervals along the path, carved with symbols and placed deliberately. Each marker seemed to signal attention to something unseen, guiding quietly through the shadows. At the edge of a shallow marsh, the investigators found a small, rickety dock. A canoe rested on the shore, tied loosely with a frayed rope. Among the reeds, tiny objects had been arranged, smooth stones, feathers, and scraps of fabric placed deliberately and quietly. The water lapped softly against the dock, echoing a slow, measured rhythm. A narrow trail led from the marsh to an old sawmill tucked into the hillside. The building was silent, its machinery rusted but intact. Inside, a workbench held scattered papers and sketches, outlines of paths, small sketches of footprints, and notes on water levels and forest clearings. Everything was recorded calmly, deliberately, with careful attention to each detail. Further along, a gravel path wound through an orchard of ancient apple trees. Fallen fruit lay scattered across the ground, and beneath one tree, a small wooden crate held stones, feathers, and tiny fragments of fabric arranged in careful patterns. A notebook nearby contained observations of sunlight, tides, and subtle movements along the orchard floor, all recorded with patient, meticulous care. A dirt road continued through the orchard toward a hidden lake, its surface smooth and reflective. A small dock extended into the water, and a rowboat floated quietly, tied to a post. Inside, faint scratches lined the wood, and nearby reeds concealed small bundles of objects, stones, feathers, and cloth arranged carefully. Investigators moved slowly, observing the quiet rhythm of presence along the shoreline. A narrow path led from the lake into a dense forest, the ground soft and uneven. Fallen logs created natural bridges over tiny streams. Along the trail, small piles of stones and sticks marked subtle patterns, and fragments of cloth were tucked among the roots of trees. Each arrangement was deliberate, quiet, and calm. At the top of a gentle rise, a small abandoned workshop appeared, its doors sagging slightly. Inside, shelves held tools neatly arranged, and a desk contained papers filled with sketches of trails, streams, and subtle movements along the landscape. Observations were recorded methodically, with calm handwriting, chronicling the slow unfolding of quiet activity over time. The investigators followed a winding path to a secluded cabin perched on a ridge overlooking a bay. Its windows reflected the gray morning light. On a table inside, papers detailed the movement of tides, the patterns of birds, and faint footprints along the shore. Small stones and feathers were arranged near the edge of the table, positioned carefully as markers or observations. A gravel road led away from the cabin into a small cluster of cottages. Doors were closed, windows dark, and the smell of damp earth lingered in the air. Inside one cottage, a notebook lay open on a table, filled with careful sketches of paths, waterways, and subtle patterns of movement. Observations were recorded slowly, deliberately, with attention to the calm rhythms of the surrounding world. Along a narrow trail, the investigators came upon a quiet pond, its water dark and still. At the edge, driftwood had been arranged into small patterns, and a canoe rested partially in the shallow water. Nearby, stones, feathers, and scraps of cloth were positioned deliberately among the reeds. Each detail seemed intended to mark attention, movement, or presence in a gentle, quiet manner. A small footbridge crossed a creek further along, worn smooth under careful passage. Beneath it, tiny objects rested in the water, smooth pebbles, a single feather, and a fragment of cloth. Investigators paused to note each one, observing the deliberate attention to placement, the quiet rhythm mirrored by the flowing water and soft rustle of leaves above. The trail led into a dense pine grove where fallen branches created natural pathways over the soft forest floor. Small cairns of stones appeared at intervals, some topped with feathers or tiny pieces of cloth. Each seemed to mark deliberate attention, subtle observations of the forest, and its quiet movements over time. A narrow road curved around the base of a hill, revealing a cluster of abandoned homes. The paint peeled from the walls, and windows were cracked or boarded. Inside one home, a desk held papers filled with sketches of paths, waterways, and faint patterns of footprints. Small stones and feathers rested on top, carefully arranged with deliberate attention. The investigators followed a winding trail to a hidden dock along a quiet bay. A rowboat floated tied loosely to the posts, its oars aligned carefully across the seats. Nearby, tiny objects had been arranged among the reeds, smooth stones, feathers, and scraps of cloth, each positioned quietly and deliberately. The water lapped softly against the dock, echoing the slow, measured rhythm of the surroundings. A narrow path led from the dock into a dense forest where soft moss covered the ground. Fallen logs and low branches created natural bridges and markers along the trail. Small piles of stones, sticks, and scraps of fabric appeared at intervals, each arrangement deliberate, quiet, and calm. At the top of a ridge, a small abandoned ranger station stood, windows fogged and doors slightly ajar. Inside, a desk held journals recording observations of tides, moon phases, and movement along the shore. Entries were careful, patient, and calm, chronicling the subtle rhythms of the world over time. The forest stretched onward, shadows deep and still, with narrow trails winding through trees and over streams. Small cairns, sticks, and carefully placed stones marked subtle patterns along the paths. Investigators moved slowly, pausing to note each detail, each deliberate placement, following the quiet rhythm that guided their steps deeper into the unfolding mystery. A narrow trail emerged from the forest onto a quiet country road, the asphalt worn and edged with wild grasses. A small, shuttered general store rested at the roadside, paint faded and peeling. Inside, shelves held dusty cans and bottles, and a ledger lay open on the counter, filled with neat handwriting recording deliveries, times, and brief notes about visitors, mostly mundane, but with occasional mention of someone passing quietly through town at odd hours. Beyond the store, the road curved toward a small and used railway siding. Rusted tracks led into the fog, disappearing among the trees. Alongside the tracks, a weathered platform held a single suitcase, closed and undisturbed. Its surface bore faint scratches, as though moved gently and repeatedly. Nearby, a scattering of stones formed a subtle pattern, small and deliberate, almost imperceptible in the morning light. A dirt path led away from the tracks into a grove of birches. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. In a clearing, investigators found a low stone wall, partially collapsed, enclosing a small plot of wildflowers. Within it, tiny bundles of twigs and leaves had been arranged in circular patterns, each circle carefully spaced, precise but understated. The path continued to a small, abandoned lodge tucked into the hillside. Its windows were intact but fogged with moisture, and the door sagged slightly on its hinges. Inside, a fireplace held ashes that had long since cooled, and on the mantel, a series of small, carefully wrapped packages rested. Each contained pebbles, feathers, and fragments of fabric arranged with deliberate care. A notebook lay open nearby, pages filled with sketches of trails and streams, observations of the moon's reflection on water, and small, subtle markings noting the passage of shadows. A narrow trail led from the lodge toward a secluded marsh. Mist hovered low over the water, softening the outlines of reeds and cattails. A small, wooden boardwalk extended into the marsh, its planks damp and creaking faintly under careful steps. Beneath the water, small stones and fragments of shells had been arranged in arcs along the edge, deliberately placed and quiet in presence. Further along, a gravel lane curved past a row of abandoned farmhouses, windows dark and doors closed. A local resident, a quiet man in his 70s, recalled seeing someone walking slowly along the fields at dusk, pausing at intervals to observe, leaving no tracks except for brief impressions in soft soil. He spoke softly, voice even, recalling details without urgency, the calm rhythm of memory matching the slow unfolding of the landscape. The trail led into a dense thicket of pines and firs, where soft moss covered the forest floor. Fallen branches created low natural bridges across tiny streams. Small piles of stones, carefully arranged twigs, and fragments of cloth appeared at intervals along the path. Each arrangement suggested patient observation, subtle attention to surroundings, deliberate yet quiet. At the top of a hill, a rickety wooden lookout platform overlooked a wide expanse of forest, fields, and distant water. Inside the platform, a bench held a small bundle wrapped in cloth, containing feathers, stones, and a thin strip of parchment with faint markings. A notebook rested nearby, its pages filled with sketches of paths, streams, and subtle patterns of footprints. Each mark was calm, careful, and precise. A narrow road wound downward toward a hidden lake, its surface dark and still, reflecting the gray sky. Along the shore, a small dock extended into the water. A rowboat lay tied loosely to a post, oars resting gently across the seats. Nearby reeds hid small, deliberate arrangements of stones, feathers, and scraps of cloth. The investigators moved slowly, noting the quiet rhythm of presence along the shoreline, the soft lap of water echoing the patient cadence of observation. A footpath led from the lake into a grove of tall pines. Fallen logs created bridges over tiny streams, and moss covered the stones along the trail. At intervals, small wooden markers appeared, carved with faint symbols and placed deliberately. Investigators paused to observe each one, noting the calm, deliberate attention embedded in their placement. A small abandoned sawmill rested at the edge of a clearing. The building was silent, machinery rusted and still. Inside, a workbench held papers filled with diagrams of paths, waterways, and subtle sketches of footprints. Notes recorded time, light, and movement with meticulous care. Every detail was calm, deliberate, and understated. A narrow dirt trail wound further into the hills to a cluster of forgotten cottages. Their roofs sagged and windows were dark. Inside one cottage, papers rested on a desk, filled with precise sketches of paths through the woods and along streams. Nearby, bundles of small stones and feathers were arranged in careful patterns. Each placement seemed intended to mark attention, quiet presence, or observation over time. The trail led onward to a quiet pond nestled among firs and birches. Water was still and reflective, mirroring the muted sky. Along the shore, driftwood had been arranged into small arcs, and a canoe rested partially in the shallow water. Nearby, tiny objects, stones, feathers, and cloth, had been positioned with deliberate care, quiet markers of observation in the calm environment. A rickety footbridge crossed a gentle stream further along. Beneath it, small pebbles, a feather, and fragments of fabric rested in shallow water. Investigators paused to note the arrangements. observing the subtle rhythm of deliberate placement, mirrored by the gentle flow of the stream and the soft rustle of leaves above. The path led into a dense grove of pines, the forest floor soft with moss and fallen needles. Small cairns and sticks appeared at intervals, some topped with feathers or tiny scraps of fabric. Each was a quiet, deliberate marker, subtly guiding attention or recording careful observation. A gravel road curved around the base of a hill, revealing a cluster of abandoned homes. Paint peeled, windows were cracked or boarded, and doors closed firmly. Inside one home, a desk held papers filled with sketches of paths, waterways, and faint footprints. Small stones and feathers rested atop the sheets, carefully arranged with deliberate attention to detail. The investigators followed a trail to a hidden dock on a quiet bay. A rowboat floated tied loosely to the posts, oars laid across the seats. Along the reeds, tiny stones, feathers, and scraps of cloth were positioned deliberately. The water lapped softly against the dock, echoing the gentle, measured rhythm of the surrounding landscape. A narrow trail led into the forest, soft with moss and pine needles. Fallen logs created natural bridges, and small piles of stones, sticks, and fragments of cloth marked subtle patterns along the path. Investigators moved slowly, pausing to note each detail, each careful arrangement, letting the quiet rhythm guide them deeper into the mystery. Atop a ridge, a small abandoned ranger station overlooked the forest and lake. Windows were fogged, the doors slightly ajar. Inside, journals recorded tides, moon phases, and subtle observations of figures along the shore. Each entry was calm, deliberate, and patient, chronicling the soft unfolding of quiet movements over time. The forest stretched onward, shadows deep and still, narrow trails winding through trees and over streams. Small cairns, sticks, and carefully placed stones marked subtle patterns along the paths. Investigators moved slowly, pausing to note each detail, each deliberate placement, allowing the quiet rhythm of observation to guide them further into the unfolding mystery. As the investigators followed the winding forest paths, the pattern of small objects, stones, feathers, and scraps of cloth began to feel less random and more deliberate. Each placement was careful, intentional, as though someone had moved quietly through the landscape for years, marking presence without drawing attention. They began to notice a rhythm, a slow, patient notation of time, light, and movement across the hills, streams, and shores. Near a shallow creek, a cluster of markers aligned with the path of the morning sun, the shadows falling across the stones in a subtle sequence. One investigator knelt to trace the arrangement, realizing that the same pattern recurred along other trails, along the lake, and beneath the docks. The realization was quiet, almost imperceptible. Someone had been mapping the land in silence, observing and recording the world with care. At a small abandoned cabin by the pond, the journals and sketches on the desk finally began to form a coherent narrative. Notes of tides, moon phases, and the reflection of sunlight on water aligned with the footprints, the placement of objects, and the careful arrangement of natural markers. Each entry was methodical, patient, and calm, chronicling not chaos but observation, the slow measurement of time and presence across the remote landscape. The investigators paused at the ridge overlooking the hidden bay. The series of docks, rowboats, and carefully placed stones all fell into a subtle order. The movement they had traced through the forest, the marshes, and along quiet roads now appeared like a map of attention itself. a record of someone quietly moving through the world, noting its small rhythms and patterns. A conversation with the elderly baker in the village added another quiet piece. He recalled a figure walking at dawn, pausing to observe, sometimes crouched along the edge of the fields or glancing at the water as the light shifted. They weren't disturbing anything, he said softly. Just being present, noticing things most people overlook. The investigators exchanged a glance, understanding slowly settling among them. Back at the abandoned lodge, the journals revealed another subtle pattern. Each sketch, each note, and each placement of stones and feathers corresponded to natural markers. Where the sunlight hit the water at a particular hour, how the wind moved through the pines, how the tides shifted along the lake's edge. The person had been recording the quiet movements of the environment, charting a gentle rhythm of the world. At the old railway siding, the scratched suitcase and patterned stones fell into a similar understanding. It was not evidence of hurried movement or concealment, but of careful attention. Each object, each placement, each note in a journal was a quiet signature, a deliberate observation of time and place over the years. The investigators moved slowly through the abandoned cottages, the orchard, and the scattered cabins, tracing the deliberate sequences and thoughtful arrangements. They began to recognize a kind of devotion to noticing the overlooked, a patient presence that had been quietly threading through the landscape, marking small moments of significance in an understated but persistent way. On the ridge overlooking the lake, with mist curling softly along the water, they finally connected the quiet footprints, the carefully arranged objects, and the journals. Everything pointed to someone who had lived apart from others, not in hiding but in attentiveness, an observer of subtle patterns, a chronicler of the gentle, shifting rhythms of this remote and quiet world. At the small dock by the hidden bay, the oars resting across the rowboat, the smooth stones arranged in arcs, and the bundles of feathers all seemed to echo the same quiet intention. Careful attention, a slow tracing of the flow of time, light, and water. The investigators understood then that the mystery was not of disappearance or danger, but of presence, of someone leaving a deliberate, patient mark upon the landscape. By the abandoned ranger station on the hill, the notebooks and journals finally made sense as a whole. Observations of tides, moonlight, shadows, and movement across fields, forests, and waterways were not random. They were a patient record of living with the land, noticing its subtle shifts, and leaving small, thoughtful markers as quiet footprints in its rhythm. Walking slowly along the moss-covered trails, the investigators felt a calm understanding settle over them. The careful placements, the journals, the subtle patterns of stones, feathers, and cloth, all revealed the same quiet truth. Someone had spent years quietly observing, connecting with the landscape in a gentle, reflective presence. Each discovery, each subtle clue, now formed a coherent picture of patience, attentiveness, and deep, understated care. The forest, the lake, the docks, the cottages, the abandoned cabins, they were no longer fragmented points of investigation, but a unified record of deliberate, quiet attention. The investigators traced the paths one last time, noting the soft rhythm that had guided each placement, each mark, each observation. There was no sudden revelation, no dramatic climax, only the slow, reflective clarity of understanding. Sitting on the ridge overlooking the misted lake, the investigators finally allowed themselves to absorb the calm of the scene. Every object, every note, Every careful mark across the landscape was a quiet testament to someone who had simply lived among the patterns of the world, leaving a subtle, patient map of presence that had gradually revealed itself.